The year was 1849, and the desert stretched in every direction like an ocean frozen mid-wave. A British explorer stood at the base of a mound that rose from the sand, unremarkable to anyone who hadn't learned to see differently. The heat pressed down with physical weight. Wind whispered across the surface, carrying particles that had once been part of something else. Walls, perhaps, or temples, or the dust of empires that forgot their own names. The locals called these hills tells. They grazed their sheep on the slopes. They built their homes nearby, but never too close. There were stories, half remembered, passed down through generations who had forgotten why they were passing them down. Don't disturb the tells. Don't dig. Something sleeps there that should remain sleeping. But no one remembered what that something was, only that the warning itself felt important enough to preserve. For centuries, travellers had passed these mounds without a second thought. They looked like natural formations, accidents of geology, the way wind and time reshape a landscape. Shepherds sat in their shade. Children played on their slopes. Above them, the sky stretched infinite and indifferent. Below them, beneath layers of sand and centuries and forgetting, lay rooms that hadn't breathed air since before Rome existed, before Greece, before anything most people would call civilization. The explorer didn't know what he would find. He couldn't have known. The very concept didn't exist yet in any framework he carried. He had theories, educated guesses, the kind of ideas that make sense in lamplight over maps and wine. But theories and discoveries are separated by the distance between imagining flight and stepping off a cliff into empty air. What waited in the darkness had been waiting for so long that waiting had become its natural state. Carved stone, baked clay, words pressed into tablets by hands that had turned to dust before the first pharaoh drew breath. Libraries sealed by accident or intention, preserved by the same forces that were meant to destroy them. The desert protects what it buries. It keeps secrets better than any vault, any conspiracy, any deliberate act of concealment. Beneath the feet of the explorer, beneath the sheep, beneath the children playing games whose rules had been invented and forgotten a dozen times over, lay the answer to a question no one had thought to ask. What came before the beginning? What stories were being told before humans learned to write stories down? Someone was about to find out. Someone who refused to believe these were just hills. Austin Henry Layard arrived with pickaxes and patience, and a conviction that bordered on obsession. The first strikes against the mound at Nimrud sounded like nothing metal against compressed earth. The rhythm of labour under an indifferent sun. Then the sound changed. Metal meeting something that rang back differently. Brick. Ancient brick, baked hard, still intact after millennia of weight pressing down from above. They dug corridors into darkness. They brought lamps that cast shadows against walls no light had touched in 2,000 years. And there, illuminated for the first time since the empire fell, were images that didn't belong to any mythology. Layard recognized winged beings with human heads and animal bodies, kings larger than life, frozen mid-hunt, mid-conquest, mid-ritual, cuneiform inscriptions running in neat rows across every available surface, as if whoever lived here had been desperate to record everything, to preserve it all, to make certain that even if the empire died, the words would survive. At Nineveh, they found something that transformed everything. A room, then another room, then entire chambers stacked floor to ceiling with clay tablets, 30,000 of them, each one covered in wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay while it was still wet, then baked hard as stone. Each one a book, a letter, a record, a fragment of a conversation that ended when the city burned. This was Ashurbanipal's library, though they didn't know his name yet. They couldn't read a single word. Imagine finding a vast library in a language that resembles no alphabet you've ever seen. The tablets arrived in European museums in crates. Scholars stared at them for hours, trying to find patterns, trying to hear meaning in marks that looked more like bird tracks than letters. It was maddening. Here was information, vast quantities of it, meticulously preserved, and it might as well have been decorative scratches for all anyone could extract from it. But among the administrative texts and royal decrees, there were tablets that seemed different, longer narratives, repeated phrases, the kind of structure that suggested story rather than inventory. And some of these tablets had a quality that puzzled the few scholars who could recognize it. They appeared to be copies of much older texts, preserved with the kind of care you'd give to something sacred, something foundational, something that predated the empire itself. What story was important enough to copy and preserve through the rise and fall of civilizations? What knowledge were they protecting from the erasure of time? The tablets sat in museum rooms, arranged on shelves like specimens in a collection of beautiful incomprehensibility. Scholars approached them with the tools they had: knowledge of Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic. Nothing worked. The wedge-shaped marks refused to resolve into anything recognizable. It was like trying to hear music by examining frozen sound waves, trying to understand a conversation by studying footprints in dried mud. Henry Rawlinson changed everything with a cliff face in Persia. The Behistun inscription, carved impossibly high on a rock wall, contained the same proclamation written in 3 different scripts. One of them, through painstaking comparison with known royal names and geographic terms, was eventually identified as Old Persian. That became the key. If you could read one script, you could begin to unlock the others. The wedge-shaped writing started to yield its secrets, slowly, like ice melting in increments too small to see, until suddenly there's water where there was only solid frozen silence. But cuneiform wasn't a language. It was a writing system, like an alphabet, used by multiple cultures across thousands of years. Beneath the Akkadian texts, beneath the Babylonian records, scholars found something older, a language that didn't fit any known family, not Semitic, not Indo-European, not related to anything spoken anywhere on Earth in recorded history. They called it Sumerian, after the land of Sumer in southern Mesopotamia, where the oldest tablets had been written. Sumerian was already ancient when Egypt was young. By the time Hammurabi carved his famous law code, Sumerian had been a dead language for 1,000 years. The Babylonians studied it the way we study Latin, as the language of learning, of prestige, of texts too important to let die. They created dictionaries, grammar guides, translation manuals. They trained scribes to read and copy texts in a tongue no one had spoken in living memory. Then the empires fell, the libraries burned, the scribes disappeared, and Sumerian died a second time, completely this time, erased so thoroughly that even the memory of its existence vanished. Until Layard's excavations, until the decipherment, until scholars in the 19th century learned to read a language that had been silent for 3 millennia. The question became, what did the Sumerians write about? What was so important that later civilizations kept copying it, kept preserving it, kept teaching it to new generations even after the language died? Administrative records, certainly. Temple inventories. Mathematical tables. The Sumerians invented writing to track commerce and tribute. But among those practical texts were others: long narratives, cosmological texts, creation accounts, stories about beings who came from the heavens. The oldest stories humanity ever wrote down weren't about harvests or heroes. They were about something that happened before humans walked the earth. They were about the Anunnaki, beings who descended from the sky, and what they did when they arrived. These texts weren't written as myths or allegories. They were written as history, as chronology, as if the authors were recording events they believed had actually occurred. What were the Sumerians trying to tell us? The scholars expected primitive myths. They expected simple creation stories, the kind that explain thunder with angry gods or blame floods on divine displeasure. Agricultural societies telling themselves comforting tales about how the world began. What they found instead was something that didn't quite fit those expectations. The texts were detailed, methodical. They named specific locations, gave precise genealogies, described technological processes with the kind of specificity you'd find in an instruction manual. The Epic of Gilgamesh wasn't just a story about a king. It placed him in a chronological framework, gave him a reign length, connected him to other kings whose reigns could be cross-referenced with other texts. The Enuma Elish didn't just say, the gods created the world. It described how, in what order, using what methods. The Atrahasis laid out a timeline of events that began before Earth existed and continued through a great flood to the present day of whoever was writing it down. What puzzled the scholars was the consistency. Different cities, separated by centuries, produced versions of the same stories, with the same characters, following the same sequence of events. The god names changed, slightly regional variations, different pronunciations, but the narrative remained remarkably stable. Enlil, Enki, Anu, Inanna, the Anunnaki who came from the heavens, the creation of humans to serve as workers, the flood that nearly destroyed everything, the kingship that descended from the sky after the waters receded. These weren't written as mythology. They were written in the same matter-of-fact tone used for grain receipts and marriage contracts. When a Sumerian scribe recorded that the king ruled for 83 years and then died, he used the same grammatical structure as when he recorded that before the flood, kings ruled for thousands of years. There was no shift in register, no indication that one statement was literal history and the other was symbolic storytelling. The Sumerian king list remains one of the most peculiar documents from the ancient world. It begins with a simple statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it lists kings with reign lengths that defy human lifespan. Alulim ruled for 28,000 years. Al-Alha ruled for 36,000 years. 8 kings, total reign time of 241,000 years. Then comes the line, the flood swept over. After the flood, the reign lengths dropped dramatically, still long by normal standards, but no longer impossible. 1,200 years, 900 years, 600 years, gradually decreasing until they reach spans that could plausibly be human lifetimes. Why would scribes preserve this? Why would the Babylonians, sophisticated mathematicians and astronomers, carefully copy texts about impossibly long-lived kings and beings who descended from the sky? Why would these specific stories be translated, retranslated, taught in scribal schools for thousands of years if they were merely entertaining fictions or primitive superstitions? The texts themselves offered no apology, no explanation. They simply stated what happened. Before the flood, this. After the flood, that. The Anunnaki came from the heavens and taught humans to build cities, to plant crops, to chart the movements of stars. To understand what they meant, we have to go back to the beginning, to the Sumerian account of how everything started, and what role these beings played in the cosmic drama that led to us. In the beginning, the Sumerians said, there was no sky, no earth, no space between, only 2 kinds of water, mixing in the darkness, dreaming gods into existence. This wasn't emptiness. It wasn't the void we imagine when we think of nothing. It was something closer to infinite potential, undifferentiated chaos, everything and nothing happening at once in a state that had no structure, no time, no distinction between one thing and another. They called the fresh water Apsu. They called the salt water Tiamat. And where these waters mixed, in the boundary between sweet and bitter, consciousness began to emerge. The Sumerians who wrote this down lived between rivers. They watched the Tigris and Euphrates flood every year, watched water cover the land and then recede, leaving behind fertile silt, creating ground where there had been only river. They saw life emerge from chaos annually, saw order arise from the mixing of waters. Their creation story reflected the landscape they knew, but elevated it to cosmic scale. Before anything existed, there were only these primordial waters, containing all possibilities, waiting to differentiate into reality. From the mingling of Apsu and Tiamat, the first gods emerged. Not created, not born in any way we'd recognize. Simply arising, the way complexity emerges from simple systems when they interact long enough. Each generation was more defined than the last, more individual, more conscious. The universe, learning to think about itself through progressive layers of awareness. This was time before time. Existence before existence organized itself into anything recognizable. The texts describe it without apology, without metaphor, as if reporting observable phenomena. The waters existed. They mixed. From their mixing came distinction, separation, the first instances of something being different from something else. And once difference existed, complexity could begin its long evolution toward the universe we inhabit. What strikes the modern reader is how alien this worldview is, and yet how strangely familiar. Not a single God-speaking existence into being through pure will. Not a cosmic accident followed by blind evolutionary forces. Something between those poles, consciousness arising from fundamental forces, divinity emerging from the universe's own nature, awareness developing through stages from undifferentiated potential to organized pantheons with names and domains and purposes. The Sumerians understood something about emergence, about how simple rules generate complex results, about how order arises from chaos through natural processes. They encoded this understanding in mythological language because that was the language they had. But beneath the poetry of primordial waters and dreaming gods lies a vision of cosmic development that parallels, in outline if not in detail, what modern cosmology describes: a universe emerging from a singular state, increasing in complexity over time, eventually becoming capable of understanding itself. From these waters, the texts say, emerged the first generation of gods, and from them, Through careful genealogy recorded across multiple tablets would come the parents of those called the Anunnaki, those who would descend to Earth, those who would decide to create us. The Sumerians knew the family trees of their gods, the way we know our own ancestors. They knew who begat whom, who ruled what, who argued with whom, as if these weren't myths, as if someone had been keeping records since before time began. From the primordial waters came Lamu and Lahamu, the first distinction, the first separation of same from different. The texts don't explain what they represented in modern terms, only that they were first, that they marked the boundary between the undifferentiated chaos of pure potential and the beginning of individual identity. From them came Anshar and Kishar, representing the horizons, the circle where sky would meet earth, before sky and earth existed as separate things. Then came the generation that marked true separation. Anu, the heaven itself, consciousness vast as space. Ki, the earth, solid and defined and distinct. For the first time in the cosmic story, there was up and down, above and below, firmament and foundation. Each generation was more defined than the last, more individual, more conscious, as if the tablets were describing awareness itself, learning to exist, learning to organize, learning to be. From Anu and Ki came the gods who would directly shape the human story. Enlil, whose name meant Lord Wind, given dominion over earth and atmosphere, the space between heaven and ground, where weather moves and life breathes. Enki, called Ea in later Babylonian texts, given dominion over the Abzu, the deep waters beneath the earth, the underground springs, the sweet water that emerged from below to sustain life in a desert land. These weren't symbolic positions. The texts describe these gods as actively managing their domains, making decisions, solving problems, arguing about methods and jurisdiction. The Sumerians tracked these genealogies with the same precision they tracked royal lineages, recording them in multiple texts across centuries, maintaining consistency in the relationships, even as language evolved and empires rose and fell. This suggested they considered divine ancestry as historical as human ancestry, worthy of the same careful preservation, subject to the same need for accuracy. Among the children and grandchildren of Anu were those called the Anunnaki. The name meant approximately those who from heaven to earth came. The number varies depending on the text, sometimes 7 great Anunnaki, sometimes 50, in some accounts as many as 600. They were assigned tasks, given responsibilities, organized into a cosmic hierarchy that managed the functioning of existence itself. Heaven needed tending, earth needed shaping, the waters needed regulating. Reality required constant maintenance to prevent it from sliding back into primordial chaos. But here, the texts introduce a problem. The work was endless. The labor of maintaining the universe, of organizing matter, of keeping chaos at bay, proved exhausting even for divine beings. The younger gods, the Igigi, bore the heaviest burden. They dug channels through primordial mud. They built dikes against cosmic waters. They extracted resources from raw earth. And the tablets record something remarkable. They grew tired. They grew resentful. They began to question why they should labor eternally while the elder gods rested. The stage was set for a crisis that would lead to a solution. And that solution would be us. The gods were tired. According to the tablets, they'd been digging in the mud for 40 periods, maybe years, maybe epochs. The translations remain uncertain. So they did what tired workers do. They went on strike. And in that moment of divine labor dispute, the decision was made to create something new. Us. The Atrahasis epic describes the rebellion in remarkable detail. The Igigi, the younger generation of Anunnaki assigned to Earth, were doing the hard work digging irrigation channels through the marshlands of early Mesopotamia, or perhaps through the chaos of unformed matter itself. The texts use language that could describe either. They worked through night cycles and day cycles, building dikes, clearing waterways, extracting minerals from beneath the surface. The work broke them slowly, the way repetitive labor breaks anyone who performs it without rest, without relief, without end visible on any horizon. One night they laid down their tools. The text says they burned them. They gathered torches and surrounded the dwelling of Enlil, the god who had assigned them this endless task. Picture it, divine beings, glowing in the darkness. Their exhaustion transformed into anger, demanding to be heard. They made their case. The labor was too much. The burden was unfair. They could not continue. Enlil responded with rage. He called the action rebellion, treason against cosmic order. He wanted them punished. But Anu, the father of gods, counseled listening. And Enki, the clever one, the solver of problems, proposed something radical. Create a new being, a primitive worker, something that could perform the labor the Anunnaki found unendurable, freeing them to return to their higher purposes. The texts present this in the matter-of-fact tone that characterizes Sumerian record-keeping. There was a problem. A solution was proposed. The solution was implemented, but the implications have fascinated scholars since the tablets were first translated. In this account, humanity wasn't created out of love, not from cosmic necessity or divine loneliness. We were created as a labor solution, a biological tool designed to perform specific tasks so that our creators could rest. The decision was made in assembly. The gods debated. Some questioned whether it was possible. Some questioned whether it was wise. But exhaustion won the argument. Enki claimed he could do it, that he could fashion a being that combined earth and divine essence, something sophisticated enough to follow complex instructions but limited enough to be controlled, to remain content with labor the gods themselves had found intolerable. The texts describe logistics. Where would they work? Who would assist? What materials would they need? These weren't abstract theological questions. They read like project planning, like engineers discussing a prototype, like administrators organizing a complex operation. Ninmah, the mother goddess, was called to assist. The Abzu, Enki's domain of deep waters, was chosen as the location, and the procedure was decided upon a mixture of clay and something divine, shaped by hands that had shaped reality itself, blessed with incantations that would bind matter to purpose. The tablets don't present this as allegory. They present it as history, as the origin point of human existence, preserved across millennia because it answered the question every civilization eventually asks: where did we come from? And the Sumerian answer was specific, detailed, and deeply strange. We came from the hands of beings who needed workers. We were designed. We were made. We were, from the beginning, intended to serve. The recipe for creating humans, according to the oldest tablets we have, was specific. Clay from above the Abzu, blood from a god chosen for his intelligence, mixed in a bath of purification, shaped by divine hands, blessed with incantations. They weren't just telling a story. They were recording a procedure. Enki called an assembly in the deep waters of the Abzu, his domain beneath the earth where fresh water springs from unknown sources. The gods gathered to witness what had never been attempted, the creation of an entirely new form of consciousness, limited but capable, mortal but aware. The tablets name those present. Ninmah, the mother goddess, whose hands would shape the clay, divine midwives who would assist in the birth of a species, and a god whose name varies by text, We, Ila, Ilawela, Geshtue, chosen for his intelligence, chosen to provide the divine element that would elevate simple clay into something that could think, reason, follow instructions. This god was slain. The texts don't linger on this. They state it as fact, as necessary component of the process. His blood was collected, mixed with clay taken from above the Abzu, clay that represented earth, matter, the physical substance of the world. The mixture was prepared in a bath of purification, combined with specific herbs and oils whose names have survived 3,000 years. Tamarisk, dates from sacred groves, butter from the first milk of cattle. Ninmah shaped the mixture with her hands. The texts describe repetition she made, not one but many, establishing breeding populations. 7 males in one account, 7 females, each one formed separately, each one blessed with the same incantations that bound consciousness to clay, that made matter capable of holding divine spark without burning up from the intensity of awareness. What's remarkable is the level of detail preserved across multiple versions. The Atrahasis says the clay was mixed with flesh and blood. The Enuma Elish specifies that bone was set within it. Some texts mention that failed attempts preceded success beings that were malformed, that couldn't speak, that couldn't breed, refined through iteration until the design achieved its purpose. This wasn't creation through divine speech, reality bending to command. This was craftsmanship, engineering, deliberate design for specific function. The Sumerians had multiple names for these first humans. Lulu, meaning primitive worker or savage. Adamu, meaning one from earth, from clay, from reddish soil. Awailu, meaning made man, manufactured, fashioned with intention. Each name emphasized a different aspect: the labor purpose, the material origin, the design nature, and each suggested the Sumerians saw fundamental difference between these created humans and themselves, as if the originals were different from what came after, as if something had changed in the bloodline over generations. The texts describe a moment after creation, where Ninmah held up her work to show the assembled gods. They saw in these beings a reflection of themselves, diminished but recognizable. They saw something that could be taught, directed, put to work in the tasks that had exhausted the Igigi. The clay figures drew breath. Their eyes opened. They became aware. And the first thing they were taught, according to the tablets, was how to dig channels, how to maintain irrigation, how to perform the labor they had been created to perform. The parallel with the Genesis account is obvious: humanity formed from dust, divine breath bringing life. But the difference is matter. In Genesis, humans are created in God's image, given dominion over the earth, placed in paradise. In the Sumerian account, humans are created in the image of gods, yes, but as servants, as tools, as solutions to a labor shortage. We were made to work. That was the purpose from the beginning. But something unexpected happened. A bond formed. Between certain Anunnaki and their human creations, something developed that hadn't been part of the original plan. The Sumerians called the place where humanity first emerged Eden. It was east, between rivers, a garden maintained by human hands for divine purposes. Sound familiar? But according to the tablets, something happened there that the gods never intended. Eden wasn't an abstract paradise floating in mythological space. The Sumerian texts placed it geographically in Lower Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates converged in ancient times, creating a landscape of marshlands and date palms and soil so rich it seemed impossibly fertile. The rivers brought life from distant mountains, depositing silt that turned desert into garden. Archaeological evidence confirms what the tablets describe this region. Genuinely was one of the first places agriculture took root, where wild grasses were domesticated into wheat and barley, where irrigation transformed possibility into abundance. But in the Sumerian account, Eden wasn't discovered by humans. It was established by the Anunnaki as a cultivation area, a worksite where the newly created humans would perform the labor their creators no longer wished to perform. The texts describe it as beautiful, productive, blessed with divine attention, but also as fundamentally a project, an operation, a carefully managed zone where gods supervised human workers in maintaining gardens, digging channels, building structures that served purposes the workers themselves might not have fully understood. The humans multiplied faster than expected. The Eridu Genesis describes rapid population growth, spreading across the region, villages becoming towns. And as they multiplied, they learned. The Anunnaki taught them, either intentionally or through observation, how to plant in rows, how to predict floods by watching the stars, how to smelt copper from ore, how to keep records by pressing marks into clay. Knowledge flowed from creators to creations, from divine minds to mortal hands. The relationship described in these texts shifts over time. Initially, clear, master and servant. The gods commanded, the humans obeyed. But gradually, something more complex developed. Some texts describe Anunnaki walking among humans, teaching directly, forming relationships that went beyond mere supervision. Some humans became priests, intermediaries, individuals who learned divine language and could communicate needs in both directions. The boundary between divine and human, originally absolute, began to blur at the edges. The tablets describe Eden as a place where heaven touched earth, where gods dwelt among their creations, where knowledge that belonged to the celestial realm became accessible to mortal minds. It was agriculture and astronomy, mathematics and metallurgy, writing itself the tools of civilization handed down from beings who remembered the primordial chaos and knew how to organize reality against entropy's pull. But something happened there that wasn't part of the plan. As humans multiplied and learned and spread across the fertile land, some of the Anunnaki began to see them differently, not as workers, not as tools, as something more, and the relationships that formed would set in motion events that would nearly destroy everything. The tablets say some of the Anunnaki looked at the humans they'd created and saw not just workers, but companions. The relationships that followed produced children who weren't quite human, weren't quite divine. And according to every version of the story, this made someone very angry. The texts are remarkably consistent across cultures about this detail. Genesis chapter 6 states it plainly. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Book of Enoch, preserving traditions that may predate the biblical text, elaborates 200 watchers descended to Mount Hermon, bound themselves by oath, and took human wives. Sumerian and Akkadian literature contain references to relationships between divine beings and mortals, though often more fragmentary, woven into king lists and hero narratives. The offspring of these unions appear throughout ancient literature with various names. Nephilim in Hebrew texts described as giants, as mighty men, as those who were famous in ancient times. Mesopotamian accounts speak of heroes of unusual size and strength, individuals who possessed knowledge beyond normal human capacity, warriors who could accomplish impossible feats. Some texts trace royal lineages back to these unions, as if divine ancestry legitimized earthly power, as if having an Anunnaki father made someone fundamentally different from common humans. What's striking is how the texts present this information not as allegory, not as metaphor, but as genealogical fact. Specific names, specific lineages, specific individuals, identified as offspring of divine fathers and human mothers. The tone remains the same, matter-of-fact recording that characterizes Sumerian historical texts. This happened. These were the children. This is how the bloodline continued. Within Sumerian cosmology, these relationships represented a violation. Humans had been created for a specific purpose, designed with deliberate limitations to keep them controllable, useful, content with their role. The introduction of divine genetics into the human population threatened that design. It created beings who were stronger, smarter, more capable than intended humans, who inherited not just physical traits but knowledge, abilities, perhaps even lifespan extensions that made them resemble their creators more than their human mothers. Some texts suggest this wasn't universal, that only certain Anunnaki participated in these relationships, particularly the Igigi, the younger gods who worked most closely with humans, who supervised their labor, who spent time among them rather than remaining in distant celestial dwellings. Proximity bred familiarity. Familiarity bred attachment. And attachment led to boundary crossings that contradicted the entire purpose of human creation. The tablets describe growing concern among the higher gods. These relationships, these offspring, represented corruption of the original plan. Humanity was spreading not just numerically but genetically, producing children who carried divine essence in ways that made them unpredictable, uncontrollable, potentially dangerous. The experiment was deviating from its parameters. The creation was becoming something other than what its creators intended. And across every version of this story, from Sumerian tablets to Hebrew scriptures to later Greek accounts of gods and heroes, the pattern remains. Divine beings produced offspring with humans, and those offspring changed everything. The question became what to do about it. The divine council met in silence. They'd watched humanity spread like wildfire across the land. They'd heard the noise, seen the chaos, witnessed boundaries being crossed. Enlil spoke. "Let us bring the waters back. Let us start again." Every god agreed, except one. The Atrahasis epic describes the progression of divine frustration in careful detail. Humanity multiplied beyond expectation, filling the land, creating noise that disturbed the gods' rest, literally. The tablets mention the clamor of humans as a source of divine annoyance. But it wasn't just about noise. Humans were developing independence, creating their own systems, spreading in ways that made supervision difficult, and some were mixing with the Anunnaki in ways that corrupted the original design. Enlil attempted solutions short of total destruction. First, he withheld rain. Drought swept across the land, crops failed, humans suffered. But Enki intervened, teaching them to dig deeper wells, to find water beneath the surface, to survive despite heaven's closed gates. Enlil sent plague next, disease that should have reduced the population to manageable levels. Again Enki intervened, sharing knowledge of healing herbs, rituals that appeased the gods who controlled sickness. Enlil blocked the fertility of the earth itself, causing soil to refuse growth. And again, Enki found ways to help humans endure, teaching them to fish more effectively, to hunt, to survive on resources. Enlil hadn't thought to restrict. The tension between the two brothers, Enlil and Enki, sons of Anu, grew with each intervention. They represented opposing philosophies. Enlil viewed humanity as a failed experiment spiraling beyond control, threatening cosmic order through uncontrolled growth and unauthorized mixing with divine bloodlines. Enki saw something different beings he'd helped create, beings that showed remarkable adaptability, worthiness of continued existence, perhaps even carrying potential their creators hadn't anticipated. The council convened in the highest heaven. The tablets describe formal proceedings, structured debate, a vote on humanity's fate. Enlil made his case. Humanity had deviated too far from intended purpose. The mixing with Anunnaki had corrupted the bloodlines. The noise and spread and independence threatened divine authority itself. The solution he proposed was radical return, Earth to its primordial state, bring back the waters that existed before creation, wash away the human experiment entirely, start fresh, or perhaps not start again at all. The gods debated. Some questioned whether total destruction was necessary. Some suggested more targeted interventions. But Enlil's argument proved persuasive. Half measures had failed. Enki would sabotage any solution that preserved humanity. Only complete reset would solve the problem permanently. The vote proceeded. One by one, the gods agreed. Humanity would end. The flood would come. Except, Enki refused to consent. He couldn't vote against the council openly. That would be rebellion, would mean war among the gods themselves. But he wouldn't agree to humanity's destruction. He sat silent while others voted, bound by divine law, not to directly oppose the council's decision, not to warn humans of what approached, not to interfere with the coming catastrophe. But silence isn't the same as compliance. And the tablets describe how Enki, clever god of wisdom and water, found a way to honor his oath, while betraying its spirit. Enki couldn't warn the humans. He'd sworn an oath to the council, but he could speak to a reed wall, describing hypothetically what one might do if a flood were coming. If a man sleeping nearby happened to hear, if that man happened to believe, if he happened to start building a massive boat in the middle of the desert, well, that wasn't Enki's fault, was it? The Atrahasis epic describes the scene with remarkable specificity. A man named Atrahasis, the name means exceedingly wise in Akkadian, slept in his reed house beside the river. Earlier Sumerian texts call him Ziusudra. Later Akkadian versions call him Utnapishtim. But across all versions, he's described as particularly attentive to divine instruction, faithful in making offerings, careful in observing rituals. Someone who'd proven himself capable of hearing and believing difficult truths. In the night, Atrahasis woke to a voice. But when he looked around his dwelling, he was alone. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, speaking not to him but to the wall itself, addressing the reeds. Reed wall, hear what I say. When the council sends the flood, you should build a boat. Abandon possessions, save life, dismantle your house, use the materials for the vessel. The boat should be covered, enclosed above and below. Bring aboard the seed of all living things. It was a loophole expressed in divine language. Enki technically wasn't warning a human. He was speaking to architectural materials. If a human happened to overhear, if that human chose to act on information not directly intended for him, the god couldn't be held responsible for failing to control every conversation within his domain. The letter of the oath remained intact, even as its spirit shattered completely. The instructions continued through that night, and perhaps several nights following. The tablets describe specific dimensions. Some versions say the boat should be square. Others describe a more traditional hull shape. The numbers vary by text, but all emphasize enormous scale. Several stories tall. Large enough for animals, provisions, family members, and workers who'd help with construction. The walls should be sealed with bitumen, the same tar-like substance used to waterproof buildings in Mesopotamia. The structure should have multiple decks for organization, a door that could be sealed from inside, a way to survive not just flooding but complete submersion. These instructions read like engineering specifications. They describe weight distribution, structural reinforcement, how to prevent water entry even under pressure. This wasn't vague divine guidance. This was technical knowledge of ship construction being transmitted to someone who'd probably never built anything larger than a river barge. Knowledge that suggested the speaker understood exactly what forces the vessel would need to withstand. Atrahasis faced an immediate problem. Building something this enormous would require help, community labor, shared resources, cooperation from people who had no reason to believe a catastrophic flood was coming. The region experienced annual flooding when the rivers rose, predictable and manageable. But a deluge that would cover the earth? That would require faith in something beyond normal experience. But the texts say he began anyway. He gathered materials. He convinced helpers. He built according to specifications whispered through a reed wall. by a god who couldn't directly save humanity but refused to watch it die. And above, unaware of Enki's betrayal, the council set events in motion that would test whether one man's faith and one boat's construction could preserve life through the return of primordial waters. The neighbors thought Atrahasis had lost his mind. He was building a boat the size of a city block in the desert and filling it with animals. But every day he kept working, and every day the sky grew darker. The construction must have been visible for miles, massive timbers rising from flat land, the skeleton of something that had no business existing so far from navigable water. The tablets suggest the project took time, but don't specify how long. Some versions hint at help beyond human workers, assistance that made the impossible schedule achievable. What's documented is the scale. Multiple decks, rooms for different purposes, structural reinforcement that suggested the builder knew forces this vessel would face. Atrahasis told his community the gods would provide abundance through this project. Whether they believed him or simply enjoyed the work and the provisions he shared, people helped. They brought timber from distant groves. They collected bitumen from natural seeps, where the earth bled black tar that could seal wood against water. They wove reed matting for roofing. They built according to specifications that came from somewhere beyond normal human engineering knowledge. Then came the animals. The tablets describe taking aboard the seed of all living creatures breeding pairs. Genetic preservation, enough to restart populations after whatever was coming. Some versions suggest animals were drawn by divine influence, arriving at the boat of their own accord as if answering a summons they couldn't consciously hear. Others imply active collection, Atrahasis and his sons ranging across the region to capture representatives of each species. The practical challenges were enormous. Housing animals with conflicting needs, those requiring water versus those needing dry ground. Predators separated from prey, managing feed and waste for weeks or months of confinement. The texts don't detail these logistics, only that they were accomplished, that the boat filled with living things, while the family prepared to join them. The social atmosphere must have been strange. A massive boat taking shape. Animals gathered in pens awaiting boarding. A man who'd been respected in his community now appearing either prophetic or insane, depending on perspective. Some neighbors probably helped until the end. Others probably mocked, made jokes about building boats in deserts, about collecting animals for an imaginary journey. But those who watched the sky noticed something. The weather changed. Clouds formed differently. The air carried weight that felt wrong, pressure building toward release. In a land where weather patterns were usually predictable, dry season, flood season, the annual rhythm of rivers rising and falling, something was behaving unpredictably. Atrahasis brought his family aboard. The last animals were herded up the ramp. Supplies were secured: grain, dried fish, oil, everything needed for survival of unknown duration. The tablets describe the moment of sealing. The door closed, made watertight, secured from inside, or perhaps, in some versions, sealed by Enki himself as a final act of protection. Inside the boat, in darkness lit only by oil lamps, surrounded by the sounds of restless animals, the family waited. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. The tablets describe the flood with unusual detail. Rain from above, water bursting from below, darkness so complete that people couldn't see their own hands, destruction so total that even the gods who'd ordered it were afraid. They'd wanted to reset the world. They'd gotten the end of the world. The rain came first. In southern Mesopotamia, where most precipitation arrived through river flooding rather than rainfall, any substantial rain was notable. But this wasn't normal rain. The tablets describe it intensifying beyond anything in collective memory, beyond anything the older stories remembered. Water fell from the sky as if heaven itself had broken, as if the firmament that separated celestial waters from earthly realm had cracked open. Then the springs. The Atrahasis epic mentions fountains of the deep, bursting forth water erupting from below ground. From the Abzu itself, the deep fresh waters that supplied wells and rivers. The separation of waters that had formed the world during creation was being reversed. The cosmos was returning to primordial state, undifferentiated chaos, everything submerged in the waters that existed before existence. 7 days and 7 nights. The number appears consistently across versions, a sacred number in Mesopotamian culture, representing completeness, totality, divine perfection. 7 days of creation, 7 days of destruction. The symmetry wasn't accidental. Inside the boat, imagine the experience. darkness so complete that the oil lamps seemed to create isolated bubbles of visibility in an ocean of black. The sound rain on the roof like continuous thunder, waves against the hull, timbers creaking under pressure, animals calling in confusion and fear. The smell of too many living things in too small a space. The movement as the boat lifted from the ground it had rested on began to float, began to be tossed by currents and winds stronger than any sailor had experienced. The Gilgamesh version preserves a remarkable detail. The darkness was so thick that one person couldn't see another sitting beside them. It wasn't just night. It was absence of light so total it became a physical presence, weight pressing down, chaos manifest as sensory deprivation. Outside, according to the tablets, even the gods were terrified. They fled to the highest heaven, gathered there cowering, watching the destruction they'd ordered exceed their expectations. Some versions describe them weeping. The divine council that had voted so confidently for reset now witnessed total annihilation and felt something that might have been regret. Enlil watched in grim satisfaction. Initially this was what he'd wanted, complete cleansing, erasure of the human experiment. But as the waters rose beyond any previous flood, beyond anything that could be controlled or contained, even his certainty wavered. The other gods cried out that the flood was too great, that they'd made a terrible mistake, that the destruction was total. Enki wept, according to some tablets. He'd saved one family, one boat, but everyone else, every human he'd helped create, every child who'd never chosen to be part of whatever offense had angered. Enlil drowned in water that came from above and below simultaneously, trapped between divine wrath expressed through the elements. For 7 days, the waters ruled. The earth disappeared beneath them. Mountains vanished, valleys filled. Everything human, every city, every village, every field and garden and temple submerged, dissolved, returned to the primordial sea from which the world had originally emerged. Then, on the 8th day, the rain stopped. 3 birds. 3 chances to learn if the world still existed outside the boat. The dove returned. The swallow returned. The raven. The raven found something to eat and never came back. That's how they knew. Life was possible again. The stillness after chaos must have been profound. No more rain hammering the roof. No more waves tossing the boat. Just silence. And the gentle rocking of water that had stopped rising, perhaps begun receding. The boat rested against something solid, a mountain peak, according to the texts, one of the few points high enough to emerge as the waters subsided. But inside, there was no way to know what remained of the world without opening the door. And opening the door prematurely, if water still covered everything, could mean flooding the interior, drowning the last survivors of the deluge. They needed information. They needed reconnaissance. Atrahasis solved the problem with birds. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves the sequence in detail. First, a dove released through an opening, watched as it circled, searching for land to rest upon. The text describes its return. Exhausted, having found nothing but water. They waited. 7 days, according to some versions, before trying again. The second attempt, a swallow, a bird that naturally seeks dry land, that needs solid ground for nesting. It circled wider than the dove, stayed out longer, gave them hope. But it too returned, confirming that water still covered the earth, that survival outside the boat remained impossible. More waiting, more rationing of supplies, more wondering if the flood would ever truly recede, or if they'd saved themselves only to die slowly of starvation in a boat floating on an endless ocean. Then the raven. Ravens are scavengers, opportunistic, capable of surviving in harsh conditions. The text is specific. The raven found carrion, fed, and did not return. It found something dead, which meant something to land on. It found food, which meant the world could support life again, even if that life was currently eating death. The absence of the raven's return was confirmation. Land existed. The waters had retreated far enough. They waited longer, still. The text suggests patience, even after confirmation, allowing more time for the ground to dry, for conditions to improve beyond mere survival threshold. When they finally opened the door, it was to sunlight that hadn't touched the interior in weeks, air that didn't smell of enclosed animals, silence that wasn't the roar of destroying waters. Atrahasis stepped onto a mountain. The tablets identify it as Mount Nisir, possibly in the Zagros range northeast of ancient Mesopotamia, though the exact location remains debated. He looked out over a world washed clean, empty, waiting. His first action, recorded consistently across versions, was building an altar, gathering stones, making an offering, sending smoke upward as signal to any gods watching that humans had survived, that the covenant between divine and mortal hadn't completely severed, that worship would continue if the gods desired it. The smoke rose, and in heaven, the gods smelled it. They gathered. The gods smelled the smoke from Atrahasis's offering, and gathered around it, hungry, the tablets say, like flies. They destroyed humanity, but they'd also destroyed the beings who worshipped them. In that moment, they realized what they'd lost. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves the image with startling directness: gods, clustering around the sacrifice like insects drawn to something they need, something they've been deprived of. For weeks, no offerings had risen from earth, no prayers, no worship, no acknowledgement of divine power. The gods had silence, and perhaps, beneath it, the uncomfortable recognition that they'd eliminated the relationship they depended on. Then Enlil arrived. His rage, according to the tablets, was immediate and volcanic. Humans had survived. Someone had betrayed the council's decision. His eyes went to Enki, the only god who'd refused to vote for destruction, the obvious suspect. The divine assembly became a courtroom, with Enlil as prosecutor demanding to know how any mortal had escaped the flood designed to eliminate them all. Enki's defense, preserved across multiple versions, is remarkable for its logic and its audacity. He didn't deny involvement. He argued justification. Was it just to destroy all humans for the faults of some? The sinful one should bear his own sin, the transgressor his own transgression. Why punish innocent children for their parents' boundary crossing? And more pragmatically, was it wise to eliminate the beings who worship you, who maintain your temples, who make the offerings you clearly desire given how quickly you gathered when smoke appeared? The tablets describe argument, negotiation, divine politics playing out while one human family waited below on a mountain. Uncertain of their fate, Enlil couldn't easily admit the flood had been a mistake that would undermine his authority, his judgment, his position in the divine hierarchy. But neither could he dismiss Enki's points, especially with other gods now nodding, now understanding what they'd lost through their vote to destroy. The compromise that emerged reshaped the human condition. Humanity would survive, would multiply, would spread across the earth again, but on different terms. The tablets describe new limitations, drastically shortened lifespans, no more kings ruling for thousands of years, no more antediluvian longevity, human existence compressed into decades rather than centuries, increased hardship in agriculture, ground that required more labor for less yield, thorns and weeds competing with crops, introduction of predators and disease as natural checks on population, and perhaps most significantly, removal of direct divine presence from daily human life. The gods would interact with humanity at greater distance, through intermediaries, through signs and omens rather than walking among mortals in the garden. Atrahasis himself received special treatment. Different texts describe different fates. Some grant him immortality, others relocate him to a distant paradise at the edge of the world, always some form of removal from normal human experience. He'd saved humanity, but no longer quite belonged to it. He'd seen too much, knew too much, had been touched too directly by divine purpose to return to ordinary life. The covenant was established. Enlil agreed not to send another flood. Some versions describe a rainbow as sign of this promise, though that detail is more prominent in biblical accounts. The gods would accept humanity's continued existence. Humanity would accept the new limitations on their lives. The world could begin again. Not as it was before that garden. That relationship, that proximity between divine and human had ended. But begin nonetheless, with one family descending from a mountain to repopulate an empty earth. They came down from the mountain to find a world wiped clean. No cities, no roads, no voices but their own. Just rich black soil, endless rivers, and a sky that seemed wider than before, as if even the heavens had learned to keep their distance. Atrahasis and his family faced a landscape simultaneously devastated and fertile, wherever the waters had reached, which, according to the texts, meant everywhere evidence of previous civilization had been scoured away or buried under layers of silt. But that same silt, deposited by receding floodwaters, created soil of extraordinary richness. Plants returned quickly. Animals multiplied in the absence of competition. The world was empty, but it was ready to be filled again. The tablets describe migration from the mountains downward toward the valley of the two rivers. Not random wandering, but purposeful movement toward the most fertile land, the places where water sources would support growing populations, where the soil was deepest and the climate most favorable. They sought the region that would become Sumer, the same land where humanity had first been created, the same gardens their ancestors had tended for the Anunnaki. The family multiplied. Genesis describes Noah's 3 sons fathering different lineages that would spread across the world: Shem, Ham, and Japheth, each becoming ancestor to distinct peoples. Sumerian texts describe similar branching without naming the same individuals. One family became multiple families. Families became clans. Clans became tribes. Tribes became peoples, spreading outward from the initial settlement point, like water finding its level, filling available space. What made this expansion possible was retained knowledge. The flood had destroyed cities and killed populations, but it hadn't erased what humans had learned. The survivors carried in their memories everything the Anunnaki had taught: how to plant in rows and irrigate fields, how to build structures that would resist wind and water, how to organize communities and distribute labor, how to domesticate animals and calculate seasons by watching stars. Knowledge proved more durable than architecture. Memory survived when stone didn't. The world they rebuilt wasn't identical to what existed before. The new limitations established after the flood were real shorter lifespans, harder labor, reduced divine presence. But the fundamentals of civilization remained accessible. They knew how to transform wilderness into gardens, how to channel rivers into irrigation systems, how to build permanent settlements rather than living as nomads. They possessed the tools, conceptual if not physical, to recreate what the waters had destroyed. The texts describe rapid population growth. Without the checks that would later develop warfare, disease, competition for resources, humanity spread exponentially. Within generations, the silence of the empty post-flood world filled with human voices again. Within centuries, the fertile plains of Mesopotamia supported thriving communities. But initially, according to the ancient accounts, they remained unified. One language, one purpose, one concentrated settlement. They could understand each other perfectly. They could coordinate on projects of any scale. They possessed collective knowledge from before the world ended. And according to the tablets, that unity concerned someone. They built a tower so high that, according to tradition, it took a year to climb from bottom to top. The plan was to reach heaven itself, to make a name that would echo through eternity. The gods looked down at what humans were building and realized, if we let them finish, there will be nothing they cannot do. Genesis chapter 11 describes humanity gathered in the land of Shinar, ancient name for southern Mesopotamia, speaking one language, unified in purpose. They decided to build a city, and a tower with its top in the heavens, explicitly stating their goal: let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. This wasn't pure mythology. The great ziggurats of Mesopotamia were genuine architectural achievements, massive stepped pyramids that dominated the landscape for miles around. The ziggurat of Babylon, Etemenanki, whose name meant Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, stood over 300 feet tall, visible from enormous distances across the flat alluvial plain. These structures took decades to build, employed thousands of workers, represented the pinnacle of ancient engineering. Their purpose was specific: connection points between earth and heaven. The temples at their summits were designed as places where gods might descend, where the distance between divine and human could be temporarily bridged. But they were also expressions of human capability, demonstrations of what coordinated civilization could accomplish. They were permanent, monumental, designed to outlast any individual or generation. They were, quite literally, humans making names for themselves. The Genesis account describes divine observation of this project. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. Then comes a remarkable statement attributed to the divine voice. Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. This was recognition of human potential. United in language and purpose, humanity could accomplish anything they set their minds to. The statement could be read as threat or promise, depending on perspective. The divine response was decisive. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. The confusion was immediate according to the text. Workers who'd collaborated seamlessly suddenly couldn't understand each other's instructions. Organization broke down. The construction project halted. Groups speaking the same language clustered together, separated from groups speaking different tongues. What had been one people became many peoples, scattered across the earth, the very outcome they'd tried to prevent through building the tower. The site became known as Babel, from the Hebrew word meaning confusion. In Akkadian, the same place was called Bab Ilu, Gate of the Gods. The irony wasn't lost on biblical authors. A structure built as gateway to heaven became instead the site of humanity's linguistic fragmentation. Whether the account preserves memory of actual events or serves as explanation for observed linguistic diversity, it marks a critical transition in the texts. Humanity after Babel was fundamentally different from humanity before. Divided, scattered, unable to coordinate on the scale they once could. The age of unity had ended. Something changed. The tablets from early Sumer describe gods who lived in temples, ate meals, had conversations with humans. Later, tablets describe gods who existed somewhere else, somewhere distant, speaking only through signs and symbols that required priests to interpret. When did they leave? The texts don't say. They just stopped appearing. The shift is subtle in the textual record, but consistent. Early Sumerian literature describes direct, face-to-face encounters between gods and humans. The Anunnaki walk in gardens, inspect offerings personally, speak directly to priests and kings, argue among themselves in ways humans can observe. These accounts have the quality of eyewitness reporting, specific details about appearance and behavior and conversation. Later texts describe increasingly mediated contact. Gods speak through dreams that require interpretation. They communicate through omens, the pattern of oil in water, the flight of birds, the shape of a sheep's liver. They make their will known indirectly, through signs that specialized priests spend years learning to read. Direct conversation becomes rarer, more ambiguous, more subject to human interpretation. The texts themselves suggest reasons for this withdrawal. The post-flood covenant established new terms for divine-human relationship, including reduced, direct intervention. The multiplication of humanity made individual attention impractical. When there were millions of humans instead of thousands, the kind of personal interaction described in early texts couldn't scale. Perhaps divine interests simply diverged from human affairs as civilization developed independence. Whatever the cause, the effect shaped Mesopotamian culture profoundly. Elaborate priesthoods developed, whose primary function was maintaining relationship with absent gods. Temples grew larger and more complex. Architectural attempts to house divine presence that seemed increasingly theoretical. Rituals became more intricate, as if perfect performance might attract attention that no longer came automatically. Divine statues took on special significance. These weren't merely artistic representations, they were believed to be actual dwelling places for divine essence, carefully consecrated through rituals that invited the god to inhabit the image. The statue's eyes were opened in special ceremonies. It was fed daily meals. It was clothed and bathed. All procedures designed to maintain presence in the face of absence. Kingship evolved in this context. Early Sumerian king lists describe rulers claiming direct Anunnaki parentage. Their fathers were gods who physically came to earth. Later kings claimed divine selection, divine blessing, divine approval, but the language shifted from biological descent to metaphorical adoption. The claim of literal divine ancestry became rarer, eventually understood as symbolic rather than factual. The tablets from Ashurbanipal's library, compiled in the 7th century BCE, often note their copies of ancient originals from Sumerian sources 1,000 years older. This suggests awareness of the gap. Modern scribes, preserving ancient texts describing world they no longer inhabited, where gods were present in ways they'd ceased to be. What's documented is the transition from presence to absence, from direct communication to mediated interpretation, from gods who walked among humans to gods who existed in distant heaven. Whether this represents theological evolution, cultural development, or, as the texts themselves suggest, actual withdrawal of beings who once inhabited Earth, the pattern is clear across the archaeological record. The Anunnaki had faded from daily human experience, but they left behind their legacy. Not all knowledge was written for everyone. Some tablets were marked secret for the initiated. Some were kept in sealed rooms in temple basements. Some allegedly preserved wisdom from before the flood, knowledge so important, so dangerous, that it required protection across thousands of years. This wasn't merely mythological claim. Archaeological evidence confirms ancient Mesopotamia practiced genuine knowledge restriction. Temple libraries existed that ordinary people couldn't access. Scribal schools required years of training before students could even see certain advanced texts. Some tablets surviving today carry explicit markers. Secret of the great gods, let the initiated, show this to the initiated. The ignorant shall not see it. What made this knowledge worth protecting? The texts themselves suggest several categories. Astronomical data describing celestial cycles spanning thousands of years, requiring generations of observation to compile. Medical procedures demonstrating understanding of anatomy, surgery, pharmacology, beyond what contemporary technology should have supported. Mathematical concepts, including geometric relationships, approximations of pi, sophisticated calculation methods, metallurgical formulas for bronze and other alloys, cosmological models describing the universe's structure in ways that wouldn't be rediscovered for millennia. Some tablets explicitly claimed to preserve wisdom from before the flood. Whether literal or metaphorical, this framing suggested knowledge originating outside normal human discovery, inherited from an earlier age, maintained through catastrophe by careful preservation. The concept shaped Mesopotamian culture's relationship with the past, viewing ancient times not as primitive origin but as golden age, possessing wisdom potentially superior to present understanding. Mesopotamian tradition described 7 antediluvian sages, the Apkallu, semi-divine beings who'd established civilization's foundations. According to the texts, these sages had brought knowledge from the gods to humans, the arts of kingship, temple construction, divination, astronomical observation, irrigation engineering. Their wisdom was supposedly preserved in temple libraries, copied and recopied across centuries to maintain continuity with distant past. Ashurbanipal's library provides tangible evidence for this preservation practice. Many tablets note their copies of ancient Sumerian originals. Some describe being found in ruins and restored. The library contained texts spanning over 1,000 years of accumulation, suggesting systematic effort to maintain access to historical knowledge, to preserve information across the lifespan of empires. This created unique cultural psychology. Mesopotamian civilization believed it possessed inherited knowledge, wisdom passed down from beings who'd existed when gods walked Earth. This wasn't fringe belief, it was embedded in institutional structures, in the organization of priesthoods, in the architecture of temples designed to protect sacred texts, in the training of scribes who spent their entire lives mastering ancient languages to read tablets their ancestors had written. The restriction of certain knowledge wasn't merely about power, though that was certainly a factor. Some texts suggest genuine belief that certain information was dangerous if misunderstood or misused. That wisdom required proper context and training to be applied safely. Others suggest knowledge deemed too sacred for common access, reserved for those who demonstrated worthiness through years of preparation. Whatever the motivations, the practice created information hierarchy, layers of accessible knowledge and restricted knowledge, public understanding and esoteric wisdom. And according to the texts, some of that restricted knowledge concerned the Anunnaki themselves, their nature, their departure, and what they'd left behind when they withdrew from direct human contact, including, the tablets hint, their offspring who remained after the flood. The flood was supposed to wash away the Nephilim, the offspring of Anunnaki and humans. But after the waters receded, the texts keep mentioning them. Giants in Canaan, heroes in Mesopotamia, men 2/3 divine. Either something survived, or it started again. Genesis chapter 6 describes the Nephilim existing in those days before the flood, and also afterward. That small phrase creates a significant problem for any literal reading. If the flood's purpose was eliminating these hybrid beings, why do they appear in post-flood narratives? Numbers chapter 13 describes Israelite spies encountering giants in Canaan, descendants of Anak, beings so large the spies felt like grasshoppers by comparison. Various Mesopotamian texts reference individuals of extraordinary size, strength, or ability, sometimes explicitly tracing their lineage to divine ancestors. Several explanations have been proposed, none entirely satisfying. Perhaps Noah's family carried genetics from earlier interbreeding, recessive traits that occasionally manifested in later generations. Perhaps the Igigi, sometimes distinguished from the Anunnaki proper in the texts, continued producing offspring with humans after the flood, the divine council's prohibition applying only to the higher gods. Perhaps these later references describe entirely different phenomena, the same language being used for unrelated conditions or peoples. Or perhaps the texts are simply inconsistent, products of multiple traditions imperfectly merged by editors who didn't notice or didn't care about the contradiction. What's documented is the persistence of the theme. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, around 2700 BCE, is described in the epic as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human son of the goddess Ninsun, and a mortal king. His size and strength were legendary, beyond normal human capacity. Nimrod appears in Genesis as a mighty hunter before the Lord, whose kingdom included Babel and other Mesopotamian cities, described in language suggesting something beyond ordinary human power. Sumerian king lists note certain rulers whose fathers were explicitly divine, whose mothers were human, maintaining the pattern of mixed ancestry well into historical periods. The tablets describe these individuals matter-of-factly, without apparent concern for how their existence contradicts the flood's supposed purpose. They're presented as heroes, founders of dynasties, builders of cities, leaders whose achievements exceeded normal human capability because they were, in some sense, more than normally human. Whether these accounts preserve genetic memory, cultural mythology, or something else entirely, remains debated. What's clear is that for many generations after the flood, Mesopotamian and related cultures maintained belief in beings who bridged the gap between divine and human. They weren't gods, they died, they struggled, they operated under mortal limitations, but they weren't quite ordinary humans either. They were something between, carrying heritage from both realms, walking the boundary between heaven and earth. Among these figures, one name appears prominently across multiple traditions, his story preserved in one of the oldest known literary works. Gilgamesh would embark on a quest that revealed much about how humanity grappled with mortality after losing the intimate divine contact of earlier ages. Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine. His strength was legendary. His deeds filled tablets. But when his friend died, he realized divinity wasn't enough. So he went searching for the one human the gods had made immortal, to learn the secret. What he learned instead changed him. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes its hero as ruler of Uruk, son of the goddess Ninsun, and a human king, possessed of size and strength that set him apart from ordinary men. He was restless, tyrannical, driving his people to exhaustion with constant building projects and demonstrations of power. The gods created Enkidu to challenge him, a wild man raised among animals, matching Gilgamesh in strength, becoming first his rival, then his closest friend. Together they accomplished impossible feats. They traveled to the cedar forest and killed Humbaba, its divine guardian. They slew the bull of heaven sent by the goddess Ishtar after Gilgamesh rejected her advances. They were heroes, invincible, unstoppable, until they weren't. The gods cursed Enkidu for his role in killing Humbaba and the bull. He fell ill. The epic describes his decline with uncomfortable detail. A warrior reduced to weakness, awareness fading, breath becoming labored. Gilgamesh watched his friend die over 12 days, unable to help, his strength meaningless against illness, his divine heritage providing no protection against the fundamental fact of mortality. Enkidu's death triggered something in Gilgamesh beyond grief. It triggered existential terror. He'd watched his friend's body cool and stiffen. He'd seen consciousness leave and not return. And he realized that despite his divine blood, despite his legendary deeds, despite tablets already being written about his achievements, the same fate awaited him. He would die, he would become clay, his strength would mean nothing. He abandoned his kingdom to search for Utnapishtim, the Akkadian name for the flood hero, the one human granted immortality. If anyone knew the secret of escaping death, it would be him. The epic describes an impossible journey crossing deserts, traversing mountain ranges inhabited by scorpion people, navigating the waters of death that no living person had crossed. Desperation drove him beyond normal human limits. He found Utnapishtim living in a distant paradise at the edge of the world, but instead of the glorious immortal figure Gilgamesh expected, he encountered someone who seemed entirely ordinary, living quietly far from human civilization, content with his garden and his wife. Gilgamesh demanded the secret. Utnapishtim responded by telling the flood story, explaining that his immortality was unique reward for unique circumstance, never to be repeated. But he offered Gilgamesh a plant from the bottom of the sea, something that might restore youth if not grant immortality. Gilgamesh obtained it with great effort. On his journey home, he stopped to bathe in a pool. A serpent smelled the plant's fragrance, stole it, shed its skin, and disappeared, leaving Gilgamesh with nothing. He returned to Uruk empty-handed. The epic's conclusion is ambiguous, whether he found wisdom or simply resignation. He couldn't escape mortality, but perhaps he learned to accept it, finding meaning in the city he'd built rather than the immortality he couldn't achieve. For 5,000 years, people have read these tablets and asked, what does this mean? Ancient Babylonians had one answer, medieval scholars had another, modern archaeologists have a third, alternative historians have a fourth. The tablets haven't changed, but we keep changing what we think they're telling us. The Babylonians who inherited Sumerian texts interpreted them through their own theological framework, syncretizing Sumerian deities with Babylonian gods, adapting narratives to justify their own political structures. The Assyrians preserved these stories while emphasizing military aspects that aligned with their imperial culture. When Greeks encountered Mesopotamian myths, they found parallels with their own traditions, flood stories, divine human offspring, cosmic battles, and incorporated elements while maintaining distinct identity. Medieval Jewish and Christian scholars grappled with Genesis chapter 6 and the Nephilim in various ways. Some read it literally, angels or divine beings producing offspring with humans, creating giants or mighty men. Others interpreted allegorically the sons of God were righteous descendants of Seth, the daughters of men were sinful descendants of Cain, and their intermarriage corrupted the righteous lineage. Still others suggested these were human rulers who claimed divine status, taking multiple wives, their mighty men, simply powerful dynasties, rather than supernatural hybrids. 19th and early 20th century scholarship approached these texts as pure mythology, primitive peoples explaining natural phenomena through supernatural narratives, creating gods to personify forces they didn't understand. This framework viewed the stories as culturally interesting but historically meaningless products of pre-scientific minds. Mid to late 20th century brought alternative interpretations, most notably the ancient astronaut hypothesis. Authors like Zecharia Sitchin reinterpreted the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial beings, their descent from heaven as space travel, their genetic engineering of humans as alien intervention in evolution. This framework reimagined the tablets as describing advanced technology misunderstood by primitive witnesses, reported in the only language available to them. Mainstream scholarship criticized these interpretations on multiple grounds. Sitchin's Sumerian translations were disputed by actual Sumerologists, who noted he misread cuneiform, mistranslated common words, and imposed modern concepts onto ancient texts. His astronomical claims about a planet called Nibiru weren't supported by Mesopotamian astronomy texts, which were sophisticated but didn't describe his proposed solar system configuration. The framework seemed to presume ancient peoples were incapable of abstract thought or sophisticated mythology, requiring literal external intervention to explain their narratives. Other interpretive frameworks emerged from different academic traditions. Jungian psychologists viewed these narratives as projections of human consciousness, archetypes of the collective unconscious, the Anunnaki representing aspects of human psychology rather than external beings. Cultural materialists saw the myths as political justification, divine ancestry claims legitimizing hierarchical societies, explaining why some ruled while others served. Literary analysts focused on narrative structure and function, examining how these stories operated within their cultural contexts regardless of historical content. Each framework offers insights. Each also has limitations. The tablets themselves remain constant clay impressed with wedge-shaped marks, preserved across millennia, containing specific claims in specific sequences. But what those claims mean depends on the interpreter's assumptions about what's possible, what's probable, what ancient peoples were capable of understanding and expressing. Perhaps the lesson isn't that one interpretation is correct and others wrong, but that these texts are rich enough to support multiple readings, complex enough to generate ongoing debate, significant enough that humans keep returning to them, seeking answers to fundamental questions about origins, purpose, and the relationship between human and divine. Every spring in ancient Babylon, they gathered to hear the story again. How the universe formed from chaos, how the gods created humans, how the flood came and humanity survived. They'd heard it hundreds of times. Why did they need to hear it again? Because the story told them who they were. Every culture creates origin narratives. The specifics vary dramatically. Some describe emergence from underground, others descent from sky, still others gradual evolution from animal forms. But the impulse is universal. Humans need to know where they came from, not just biological ancestry, but cosmic context. What kind of universe do we inhabit? What is our relationship to forces greater than ourselves? What purposes, if any, guided our creation? The Anunnaki narratives provided ancient Mesopotamians with comprehensive answers. They explained human existence. We were created deliberately by beings from the sky, designed for specific purposes. They justified social hierarchy. Kings descended from or were chosen by gods, their authority deriving from divine lineage or selection. They established purpose for temple service, maintaining relationship with creators through offerings and rituals. And perhaps most importantly, they provided identity, a clear understanding of human position in cosmic order. These narratives positioned humans precisely in the universe, created by higher beings, yes, but not equals to them, valued enough to be preserved through catastrophic flood, suggesting we weren't disposable or insignificant, capable of learning divine knowledge, writing, mathematics, astronomy, organization, demonstrating potential beyond basic survival. Yet ultimately mortal, separate from divine realm, operating under different laws and limitations than our creators. This cosmology allowed specific responses to life's challenges. Hardship could be accepted. The post-flood covenant established that life wasn't meant to be easy, that labor and mortality were fundamental to human existence. Divine favor remained possible. The gods still watched, still communicated through omens and dreams, still responded to offerings and prayers. Morality had clear foundation laws derived from divine instruction, justice modeled on divine council decisions, ethics rooted in maintaining proper relationship with cosmic order. These weren't abstract philosophical concepts. They were embedded in calendar rituals, New Year festivals, coronation ceremonies, temple dedications. The Enuma Elish was recited annually during the Akitu festival, re-performing creation, re-establishing cosmic order, renewing the world. Each telling reinforced communal identity, reminded listeners of their origins, maintained continuity with deep past. Regular narration of origins served psychological and social functions. Modern secular societies fulfill differently. National founding stories create identity and unity. Scientific models of human evolution provide context in natural history. Philosophical frameworks explain human nature and purpose. Ancient Mesopotamians accomplished all this through their creation narratives, stories that were simultaneously history, theology, political charter, and psychological anchor. Whether the stories were literally true mattered less than what they accomplished. They gave meaning, they provided context, they connected present to past, individual to community, human to cosmos. They answered the fundamental questions that drive human consciousness toward narrative. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What happens next? The tablets preserved these answers across millennia because the questions themselves never stop being asked. Each generation needs to hear its origin story again, to remember who it is in the vast context of time and space. In 1994, archaeologists in Turkey found a temple complex built by people who had no cities, no agriculture, no writing. It was 11,000 years old. According to everything we thought we knew about human history, it shouldn't exist. But there it was, carved into stone, impossible to deny. Göbekli Tepe changed assumptions about the development of civilization. Before its discovery, the sequence seemed obvious. Humans developed agriculture, which allowed permanent settlement, which enabled specialization, which eventually led to monumental architecture. The progression was logical, linear, supported by decades of archaeological evidence. Then, Göbekli Tepe appeared and reversed the sequence. The site consists of massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing 16 tons, elaborately carved with images of animals and abstract symbols. They're arranged in circular structures that required significant organization to construct, and they predate agriculture by thousands of years. Hunter-gatherers, supposedly living hand-to-mouth, supposedly lacking the surplus resources and social organization for major construction projects, built this. Then, for reasons unknown, they deliberately buried it, covering the entire complex with tons of earth. The discovery forced reconsideration of what early humans were capable of. Other sites began appearing in new light. Çatalhöyük, a sophisticated city existing around 7500 BCE with advanced social organization, no longer seemed like an isolated anomaly. Megalithic structures across the Mediterranean demonstrated engineering capacity their builders supposedly lacked. The Sphinx's weathering patterns, suggesting water erosion in a region that hasn't experienced sufficient rainfall since before Egyptian civilization existed, became harder to dismiss. These aren't fringe claims. They're mainstream archaeological findings that complicate previous models of human development. Human history appears less linear than assumed, with capabilities emerging earlier, disappearing, re-emerging in different locations. Progress wasn't inevitable or continuous. Civilizations rose and fell, sometimes taking their knowledge with them. What makes these discoveries intriguing in context of ancient flood narratives is timing. Göbekli Tepe dates to approximately 9600 BCE. The Younger Dryas period, marked by catastrophic climate change, sudden temperature shifts, massive flooding from melting ice sheets, ended around 9600 BCE. The geological boundary between these eras shows evidence of significant environmental disruption, possible comet impacts, species extinctions, and the collapse of earlier human settlements. Ancient texts claim knowledge and civilization existed before the flood, that some was preserved through catastrophe, by deliberate effort. When these texts were first translated in the 19th century, the claim seemed absurd. Human civilization began with Sumer around 3000 BCE. Everyone knew that. Now we have evidence of sophisticated construction and organization 6,000 years earlier than Sumerian civilization, existing right around the time multiple cultures claim a world-altering catastrophe occurred. This doesn't prove the literal truth of flood narratives or the existence of the Anunnaki, but it does suggest human history is more complex than linear progressive models indicated. Capabilities existed earlier than thought. Knowledge was lost and recovered. The world ancient peoples inhabited was stranger than we assumed, and perhaps their memories of it preserved more truth than we credited them with. The question becomes not whether ancient peoples could have experienced civilization-ending catastrophes. Geological evidence confirms they did, but whether their texts about those events preserve genuine historical memory beneath. Mythological language. Geologists have found evidence of catastrophic floods in human history. Not one flood, multiple floods. Different times, different places, different causes. But the pattern repeats. Sudden water, massive displacement, communities drowned. Maybe the ancients weren't just making up stories. Maybe they were trying to remember. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, proposed by marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, describes an event around 5600 BCE, where the Mediterranean breached a natural dam at the Bosphorus. Water poured into a freshwater lake basin at rates dwarfing even Niagara Falls. Within months, possibly days, the lake became the Black Sea. Sea levels rose hundreds of feet. Farming communities around the shores were displaced or drowned. Evidence appears in submerged settlements. Sudden salinity changes in sediment cause underwater river channels suggesting catastrophic inflow. The timing and location place this event in the right region to influence Mesopotamian flood narratives. Communities fleeing the deluge would have migrated south, carrying memories of sudden water, lost homes, world-changing catastrophe. The dates don't align perfectly with when the Sumerian texts claim their flood occurred, but cultural memory across thousands of years rarely maintains precise chronology. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis describes something larger. Evidence suggests around 10,800 BCE, comet or asteroid fragments impacted Earth, triggering sudden climate change. Temperatures dropped dramatically. Ice sheets melted rapidly, causing massive flooding. Species went extinct. Early human settlements that had existed for millennia disappeared from the archaeological record. The boundary layer at this geological period shows unusual concentrations of platinum, nanodiamonds, and other materials consistent with extraterrestrial impact. What's remarkable is the universality of flood narratives across cultures with no known contact. Sumerian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, Chinese, Native American, Australian. Aboriginal, virtually every ancient culture preserves stories of world-destroying deluge. The details vary, but the core remains consistent. Water covered the earth. Humanity nearly perished. Few survived to rebuild. This universality suggests either common source, common experience of localized floods, misremembered as global or genuinely worldwide catastrophes. Geological evidence supports the third option more than previously thought. Massive flooding events occurred multiple times in human history. Underwater structures off the coasts of Japan, India, and the Mediterranean suggest settlements now submerged. Sea levels rose dramatically and relatively quickly as Ice Age glaciers melted. Evidence shows sudden freshwater outflow events from glacial lakes, releasing volumes of water that would have appeared apocalyptic to anyone experiencing them. Scientific caution is warranted. Yes, major flooding events occurred, Yes, they would have been catastrophic for populations that experienced them, but connecting any specific geological event to any specific ancient narrative remains speculative. The timescales are vast, the archaeological record incomplete, and human memory imperfect across millennia. Yet the parallels are intriguing. Many flood narratives worldwide specify similar details. Warning given to one righteous family, boat construction following specific instructions, preservation of animals, landing on a mountain, sending out birds to test whether waters had receded. These aren't vague similarities. They're specific procedural matches suggesting either cultural transmission of a single story across vast distances and time periods, or multiple cultures, independently experiencing and recording similar catastrophes using similar survival strategies. The geological evidence confirms the catastrophes occurred. The textual evidence confirms ancient peoples remembered them, considered them significant enough to preserve across generations, embedded them in their origin narratives. Whether any single text describes any single event accurately may be unknowable, but the claim that ancient peoples experienced world-changing floods isn't mythology, it's geology. The Babylonians knew about the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle that takes 26,000 years to complete. They knew planets' orbital periods accurate to within tiny fractions. The Greeks built a computer 2,000 years ago. Sometimes ancient people knew things they shouldn't have known, and sometimes their texts claimed it was taught to them. Astronomical knowledge in ancient Mesopotamia was remarkably sophisticated. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis causing the position of stars to shift over millennia, is observable only through centuries of careful record-keeping and complex mathematical analysis. Yet, Sumerian and Babylonian texts demonstrate awareness of this phenomenon. Their astronomical tablets calculate planetary movements, predict eclipses, track celestial cycles with precision, requiring both long-term observation and advanced mathematics. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck off Greece, dates to approximately 100 BCE. It's an astronomical computer, using bronze gears to model the movements of the sun, moon, and planets. The sophistication of its construction, including differential gearing not seen again until the 16th century, suggests technological capability far beyond what contemporary Greek society should have possessed. Yet there it is, preserved in corroded bronze, impossible to dismiss as modern contamination. Ancient structures demonstrate astronomical alignments requiring sophisticated surveying and mathematical knowledge. The pyramids of Giza align precisely with cardinal directions and specific stars. Stonehenge tracks solar and lunar cycles with architectural precision. Angkor Wat encodes astronomical information in its dimensions and orientation. These aren't approximate or accidental, they're exact, suggesting either centuries of trial and error or inherited knowledge from earlier sophisticated observers. Various ancient maps show unexpected accuracy. The Piri Reis map, compiled from older sources in 1513, depicts South American coastlines and possibly Antarctica, with details supposedly unavailable until modern surveying. Mainstream historians explain these as lucky coincidences or misinterpretations of what the maps actually show, but questions remain about information sources for certain features. Ancient metallurgy reveals empirical chemistry knowledge. Bronze requires specific ratios of copper and tin, temperatures precisely controlled, techniques refined through understanding of material properties. Some ancient steel production methods produced quality not matched until modern times. The Damascus steel forging process, eventually lost and only recently partially reconstructed, demonstrates metallurgical sophistication, requiring deep practical knowledge. Ancient medicine shows surprising capability. Surgical instruments found in archaeological sites reveal procedures being performed: trepanation, cataract surgery, amputation with survival rates suggesting infection control. Medical texts describe treatments and diagnoses that align with modern medical understanding. The Edwin Smith papyrus from ancient Egypt reads like a trauma surgery manual, methodically describing injuries and treatments with remarkable accuracy. Mathematical sophistication appears earlier than expected. Babylonian mathematics understood the Pythagorean theorem 1,000 years before Pythagoras. Egyptian geometry knowledge required for pyramid construction implies understanding of pi, golden ratio, and complex spatial relationships. Calendar systems across cultures required precise astronomical observation and sophisticated calculation to maintain accuracy. The ancient texts themselves claim this knowledge was taught. The Sumerians described the Anunnaki instructing humans in agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, metallurgy, medicine, writing. The concept of antediluvian wisdom, preserved through catastrophe, appears across cultures' knowledge from before the flood, maintained by priesthoods, carefully transmitted through civilizational collapse. Could some accurate astronomical, mathematical, or technical knowledge have been preserved from earlier, perhaps destroyed civilizations? The preservation of knowledge across cultural upheavals is documented historically. Greek texts preserved by Islamic scholars, Roman knowledge maintained in monasteries, Chinese bureaucratic records surviving dynastic changes. Information survives catastrophe when someone considers it important enough to protect. Whether this explains all anomalous ancient knowledge remains debatable, but dismissing the possibility entirely requires ignoring both the evidence for ancient capability and the consistent claims in ancient texts about inherited wisdom. The Sumerian king list doesn't read like mythology. It reads like a bureaucratic document. Name, reign length, notable deeds, next king. The early kings ruled for thousands of years, yes, but the list treats this as fact, not fantasy. Whoever wrote this believed they were recording history. Examining the tablets as literary documents reveals interesting characteristics. There's a distinction between clearly mythological literature, where symbolic intent is evident through poetic language, allegorical structure, or explicitly fantastic elements and texts presenting themselves as history or documentation. The Anunnaki narratives often fall into the second category. They maintain consistent genealogies across multiple texts, spanning centuries. The same divine family trees appear in documents from different cities, different time periods, different authors, with remarkably stable relationships and sequences. They specify geographical locations, not vague, somewhere in the east, but actual places that can be identified on maps. They provide precise measurements and numbers, the kind of detail that appears in administrative records rather than epic poetry. And they employ matter-of-fact tone, describing divine actions in the same grammatical structure used for mundane transactions. The Sumerian king list exemplifies this. It begins, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." Then it lists kings with impossibly long reigns, 28,000 years, 36,000 years. The flood occurs. Then it continues listing kings, but now with plausible reign lengths 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, as if recording actual historical succession. The structure suggests the authors viewed antediluvian and post-diluvian history as continuous, both equally historical, despite the wildly different lifespans. These texts were preserved with extraordinary care, copied and recopied across generations, translated into multiple languages as empires rose and fell, maintained in temple libraries, accessible only to trained scribes, taught in scribal schools, where students spent years mastering ancient Sumerian to read original compositions. This level of preservation suggests cultural consensus about the text's importance. The question of cultural memory becomes relevant. How long can accurate information be preserved through oral tradition before being written down? Studies of oral cultures show remarkable accuracy for hundreds of years. Sacred or critically important information can be maintained even longer through formalized recitation, where deviation from established wording is socially sanctioned. The Sumerian texts we possess date to approximately 2500 to 2000 BCE, but describe events supposedly occurring much earlier. Could they preserve accurate memories from the Uruk period, beginning around 4000 BCE, or even earlier? The time span seems long, but parallels exist in other cultures. Herodotus preserved accurate information about events centuries before his time. Celtic oral traditions maintained verifiable genealogies across many generations. Aboriginal Australian songlines encode geographical information across thousands of years, recently confirmed through archaeological evidence. The tablets don't present themselves as allegory or symbolic teaching stories. They present themselves as records of what happened, who the Anunnaki were, what they did, when and why they did it, and what resulted for humanity. The authors may have been wrong. They may have been preserving mythology they believed was history, but they weren't writing fiction they knew was invented. They were recording what they understood to be true. That doesn't make it true, but it makes it worth examining seriously as potential historical memory preserved in mythological language. What if everything we think we know about when civilization started is wrong? Not by decades or centuries, but by millennia. What if there was something before, something sophisticated, something real that was destroyed so completely we've only found fragments. The ancient texts say there was. Could they be right? The idea of a lost advanced civilization appears across cultures worldwide. Plato described Atlantis, a sophisticated society destroyed by catastrophe. Hindu tradition preserves the Yuga cycles, ages of the world where earlier eras possessed greater knowledge and capability. Aztec mythology describes the four suns, previous worlds destroyed and recreated. Mesopotamian texts describe the antediluvian world where gods walked among humans and knowledge flowed freely before the flood erased it all. What would a genuinely lost civilization look like in the archaeological record? Perhaps not what we expect. Stone monuments endure, but most construction materials decay. Wood, reed, fabric, leather, all disappear within centuries under normal conditions. Coastal settlements, where populations naturally concentrate, would be submerged by sea level rise. The world's shorelines during the Ice Age sat 400 feet lower than today, placing major population centers under hundreds of feet of ocean. Catastrophic destruction could scatter or bury evidence so thoroughly that later discoveries might be attributed to wrong time periods or misunderstood entirely. Consider specific scenarios. A civilization existing during the last Ice Age when coastlines were dramatically different, concentrating in now submerged areas where archaeological investigation is difficult and expensive. An advanced culture focused on astronomy, mathematics, and organic architecture that left minimal stone monuments, its sophistication visible in knowledge rather than buildings. Or a society whose material culture we've found but dated incorrectly, artifacts scattered across sites we don't recognize as connected. History demonstrates how quickly knowledge can be lost during cultural disruption. The fall of Rome led to loss of concrete technology for over 1,000 years, a material Europeans couldn't replicate until the modern era, despite having Roman structures standing as examples. The Bronze Age collapse destroyed multiple civilizations simultaneously, scattering their knowledge, breaking transmission chains, forcing survivors to rebuild from diminished understanding. The burning of the Library of Alexandria eliminated texts that existed nowhere else, knowledge preserved in single copies lost forever. Preserved knowledge from such a civilization might appear exactly like the anomalous knowledge examined earlier. Accurate astronomical data requiring centuries of observation, sophisticated mathematical understanding, precise geographical knowledge, advanced metallurgical techniques, medical procedures that work despite lacking modern theoretical frameworks. These would be fragments, individual pieces surviving catastrophe through deliberate preservation or accidental good fortune. Mainstream archaeological consensus holds that human civilization developed gradually from the Neolithic Revolution onward, and this model fits most available evidence. The burden of proof for alternative timelines rests with those proposing them. But absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence, particularly for periods before 10,000 BCE, when human activity was limited, preservation conditions poor, and much evidence could remain undiscovered or unrecognized. The ancient texts consistently claim knowledge and civilization existed before the flood. They describe it being deliberately preserved by those who saw catastrophe approaching. Whether this preserves historical memory or simply represents how cultures explain possessing inherited wisdom remains open to interpretation. But dismissing the possibility entirely requires assuming we've already found all evidence there is to find. Were the Anunnaki gods? Aliens? Humans from a lost civilization? Beings from other dimensions? Metaphors and myths? Every framework makes some of the evidence make sense. None of them make all of it make sense. Maybe that's the point. Maybe we're asking the wrong question. The mythological interpretation treats the Anunnaki as products of human imagination, personifications of natural forces, projections of human psychology onto cosmic scale, stories created to explain the inexplicable and give meaning to existence. This framework is convincing. The narratives contain clearly mythological elements like gods, fighting demons, cosmic battles determining reality's structure, magical objects with impossible properties. The Anunnaki resemble other cultures' pantheons, following archetypal patterns recognizable across human storytelling everywhere. The extraterrestrial hypothesis interprets the Anunnaki as advanced beings from elsewhere. Their descent from heaven becomes literal space travel. Their genetic engineering of humans represents intervention in human evolution. Their cities and technology appeared as divine power to primitive humans lacking context to understand advanced science. What makes this compelling to some? The specific technical details in texts, the global similarity of ancient astronaut narratives, the seemingly rapid emergence of Sumerian civilization with sophisticated knowledge. What makes it unconvincing to most scholars? Lack of direct physical evidence, reliance on disputed interpretations of ancient languages, and scientific implausibility of described mechanisms like interstellar travel or genetic engineering without modern laboratory infrastructure. The advanced human civilization hypothesis suggests the Anunnaki represent a lost human culture, perhaps destroyed in the Younger Dryas catastrophe around 10,800 BCE. They're remembered through oral tradition and mythologized over millennia, their technology and knowledge seeming godlike to later, less advanced populations. This explains why they're described in essentially human terms. They ate, slept, argued, made mistakes while possessing capabilities beyond normal human societies. Interdimensional or consciousness-based interpretations view the Anunnaki as representing interaction with non-physical entities or dimensions of reality. Perhaps experiences in altered states of consciousness, encounters with aspects of collective unconscious, or contact with intelligence existing in forms we don't have frameworks to understand. This addresses why physical evidence remains elusive, while experiential accounts persist across cultures. Each framework makes certain evidence explicable, while leaving other evidence problematic. The mythological interpretation explains the archetypal patterns, but struggles with the specific technical details and consistent genealogies. The extraterrestrial hypothesis addresses the advanced knowledge claims, but lacks physical evidence, and requires accepting scientifically unlikely scenarios. The lost civilization theory fits geological evidence for catastrophes, but needs more archaeological support. The consciousness-based interpretations explain the universal patterns, but can't be tested empirically. Choosing between these frameworks often comes down to prior assumptions about reality's nature. What you already believe is possible shapes which interpretation seems most plausible. Perhaps the question isn't which single explanation is correct, but whether multiple factors might have contributed to narratives that are simultaneously mythological, historical, and experiential. 5,000 years later, we're still telling versions of these stories. Still asking whether we were designed or evolved, created or accidental, here for a purpose, or making our own meaning. The Sumerians didn't invent these questions, but they gave us one of the first recorded attempts to answer them. Origin stories shape collective identity profoundly. Believing your ancestors were created by gods affects cultural confidence. You're not random. You're intentional. You matter to cosmic forces. Understanding yourself as product of divine purpose shapes moral frameworks. Ethics derive from Creator's will. Justice reflects divine order. Meaning comes from fulfilling intended role. Seeing creation as deliberate design versus random evolution fundamentally alters worldview, affecting everything from politics to personal identity. Ancient Mesopotamian culture was structured around these narratives. Kings claimed descent from or selection by gods, legitimizing their authority through divine connection. Priests served as intermediaries between divine and human realms, their power deriving from specialized knowledge of maintaining that relationship. Laws weren't merely human agreements, but expressions of divine wisdom, making justice cosmic rather than arbitrary. Economic systems included temple obligations, offerings to maintain divine favor, tithes, supporting priesthoods because the gods required service. These narratives spread and transformed across millennia. Sumerian stories were adopted by Akkadians, adapted by Babylonians, preserved by Assyrians, each culture modifying details while maintaining core elements. Hebrew scriptures incorporated and transformed Mesopotamian flood narratives and creation accounts. Greek and Roman traditions interacted with Near Eastern mythology, creating syncretic blends. Early Christianity developed in cultural context saturated with these ancient stories, echoes audible in Genesis, in Revelation, in theological concepts about human nature and divine purpose. Modern influence persists. The concept of humans, as designed beings, created for purpose, fundamentally shapes how billions approach questions of meaning and ethics. It affects responses to scientific discoveries, political philosophies, personal identity. The alternative understanding humans as products of evolution, purposeless except what we create, accountable only to ourselves, and each other represents radically different framework with different implications for how to live, what to value, what happens when we die. The Anunnaki narratives specifically continue resurfacing. New Age spirituality incorporates them into theories about human spiritual evolution. Ancient astronaut theories reinterpret them as evidence of extraterrestrial contact. Academic Assyriology studies them as windows into ancient Near Eastern culture. Religious comparative mythology examines them for universal patterns in human meaning-making. Each group finds different value in identical ancient texts. The persistence suggests these stories address something fundamental in human consciousness: the need to understand origins, to locate ourselves in cosmic context, to know whether we're here for reasons or by accident. The Sumerians formulated one answer 5,000 years ago. We're still wrestling with the question, still creating new versions of old stories, still seeking meaning in narratives about where we came from and why. There's a space between believing every word and dismissing everything. A space where we can examine these texts with respect and skepticism, curiosity and caution, where we can ask what they might mean without insisting we know what they must mean. That's the space where learning happens. The dismissive approach treats all ancient texts as primitive superstition, products of inferior minds, obstacles to scientific understanding rather than legitimate attempts to make sense of human experience. This perspective risks losing potential historical information embedded in mythological framework. It discards psychological and philosophical insights about human nature accumulated over millennia. It dismisses cultural wisdom without examining whether any of it might be valuable. And it disrespects our ancestors' intellectual capabilities, assuming modern people are fundamentally smarter rather than simply possessing different tools and contexts. Conversely, uncritical acceptance creates its own problems. It ignores what we genuinely know through scientific investigation, geological timescales, biological evolution, physical laws that constrain what's possible. It forces ancient texts to bear interpretive weight they were never designed to carry, reading modern concerns into ancient material. It imposes contemporary frameworks, whether scientific or New Age, onto texts from radically different cultural contexts, where words meant different things and assumptions differed fundamentally from ours. And potentially, it leads to choices based on misunderstood ancient claims, taking life guidance from texts we're not reading correctly. A middle path involves taking these texts seriously as sophisticated products of intelligent people grappling with fundamental questions while maintaining critical thinking and scientific rigor. It acknowledges they may preserve historical kernels within mythological shells, actual events or knowledge wrapped in narrative frameworks that made sense to their authors. It recognizes they serve important cultural and psychological functions regardless of literal truth, providing meaning, identity, moral frameworks, and connection to deep past. This balanced approach means reading texts in original languages when possible, or consulting multiple translations when not. Understanding their cultural context: what did these words mean to the people who wrote them? What assumptions did they hold? What problems were they trying to solve? Comparing multiple versions and traditions to identify core elements versus local variations. Holding multiple interpretations simultaneously without requiring immediate resolution. Being comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. Some questions may not have definitive answers. We may never know with certainty whether the Anunnaki narratives preserve memories of actual historical events, represent entirely mythological constructions, or combine both in ways we don't yet understand. Archaeological evidence may emerge that changes the picture, or we may have already found everything there is to find. Interpretations may converge toward consensus, or this may remain perpetually contested territory. What we can know is that these texts mattered to the cultures that created and preserved them. They were considered important enough to copy across generations, translate across languages, maintain through political upheavals and cultural transformations. Engaging with them respectfully, neither dismissing them as worthless nor accepting them uncritically, can provide insights into both ancient peoples and ourselves, into how humans create meaning, preserve knowledge, understand their place in the cosmos. The question isn't necessarily what these texts prove about cosmic history. It's what they reveal about human nature, human needs, human attempts to make sense of existence in a vast and mysterious universe. To become a scribe in ancient Babylon, you had to copy the old stories. Not once, hundreds of times. The creation myth, the flood narrative, the lists of antediluvian kings. You wrote them until your fingers knew them, until you could recite them in your sleep. That's how stories survive millennia, through countless hands writing the same words into wet clay. The Aduba, the tablet house, was where this happened. Imagine a room filled with young students, clay tablets everywhere, the smell of wet earth mixed with the sharp tang of fresh reeds used as styluses. They sat for hours, pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft clay, copying signs hundreds of times to master their formation. Teachers walked between them, correcting mistakes, showing the proper angle for each stroke. It was physical work, repetitive, demanding. Your hand had to learn the language as much as your mind. Students began with the simplest elements, basic word lists, syllabaries, the building blocks of cuneiform. They progressed to mathematical texts, learning to calculate areas and volumes. Then administrative documents, the practical work that would employ most scribes throughout their careers. Recording grain deliveries, documenting temple offerings, managing trade accounts. But the advanced students, those destined for the highest ranks of the scribal profession, eventually reached the literary and religious texts. The creation myths, the flood narratives, the genealogies of gods and antediluvian kings. This wasn't casual reading, it was internalization. Scribes copied these texts again and again until every line was memorized, until the stories became part of their mental architecture. We found the evidence in student tablets discovered across Mesopotamia practice exercises, showing the same passages copied repeatedly, mistakes visible alongside corrections, the physical record of knowledge being transmitted through embodied practice. Muscle memory, embedding the stories as deeply as conscious thought. Scribes held elite positions in Mesopotamian society. They were gatekeepers of written knowledge, respected specialists whose skills were essential for everything, from administration to religious practice. Without them, trade stopped. Temples couldn't function. Laws couldn't be recorded. Cultural continuity depended on their literacy. But they weren't just copying machines. Scribes actively maintained and updated the texts they preserved. They added commentary explaining obscure references. They cross-referenced different versions of the same story, noting textual variants. They created catalogues organizing their libraries. They made choices about what to preserve and what to let fade away. And here's what matters. They chose to preserve the old stories. Even after Sumerian became a dead language, spoken by no one, scribes continued copying Sumerian literature. They maintained multiple versions of the same narratives, preserving variations rather than standardizing to a single text. They kept tablets that had no obvious practical utility, stories about gods and floods and ancient kings, when they could have focused entirely on contemporary administrative needs. Someone decided these stories were worth keeping. Generation after generation of scribes made that same decision, copying the words their teachers had copied, preserving narratives for reasons we can only partially reconstruct. The Anunnaki stories survived because individual humans chose to preserve them. The stories changed as they traveled. Sumerian became Akkadian became Babylonian. Names shifted, details varied, but the core remained. Gods from the sky, humans created from clay and divine blood. A flood that destroyed the world. A man who survived by building a boat. Why did everyone keep telling the same story, just in different languages? Sumerian was a language isolate, unrelated to any other known tongue. When Akkadian speakers, Semitic people, whose language was entirely different, encountered Sumerian culture, they faced a translation challenge. They created bilingual dictionaries, word lists matching Sumerian terms to Akkadian equivalents. These weren't simple one-to-one correspondences. Concepts shifted in translation. Meanings expanded or contracted. Deities merged or separated as they moved from one cultural context to another. The flood hero demonstrates this perfectly. In Sumerian, he's Zu-Sudra. In Akkadian, he becomes Atrahasis, meaning exceedingly wise. In Babylonian tradition, he's Utnapishtim. Same character, same essential story, but his name transforms with each language, each retelling carrying slightly different emphases while maintaining the narrative core. The gods themselves traveled across linguistic boundaries. Enki remained recognizable even when identified with Akkadian Ea. Enlil maintained his identity as Elil. The pantheon structure survived. Translation, divine relationships and hierarchies preserved even as pronunciations shifted and local variations emerged. Babylon's rise to political power appeared in its religious texts. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation epic, elevated Marduk to supreme status among the gods, positioning him as the hero who defeated primordial chaos and established cosmic order. But beneath this political theology, older Sumerian cosmological elements remained visible. The primordial waters, the separation of heaven and earth, the divine genealogies connecting back to creation's first moments. New empire, new emphasis. But the foundation stayed the same. What remained remarkably constant through all these cultural transformations? The flood narrative's essential elements. The warning given to one man. The boat built to specific dimensions. The animals preserved. The mountain landing. The birds sent out to test whether water had receded. Different cultures, different languages, different time periods. But these procedural details persisted with striking consistency. Why did each new culture adopt these stories rather than creating entirely new myths? Perhaps they believed the narratives were historically true, actual records of real events. Perhaps political legitimacy came from continuity with the ancient past, and claiming connection to these established traditions strengthened new rulers. Or perhaps the stories possessed inherent power, coherence that made them worth preserving regardless of their origin. Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king who created the ancient world's most famous library, deliberately collected tablets from across Mesopotamia. His library preserved texts in multiple languages and versions, maintaining Sumerian originals alongside Akkadian translations alongside later commentaries. This wasn't just cultural appropriation or political consolidation. It was archival intent studying these stories, comparing them, understanding their variations. The narratives spread far beyond Mesopotamia. Elements recognizable in Hebrew scriptures, Phoenician myths carrying them to Greece and Rome, Persian traditions incorporating Mesopotamian cosmic structures. Either these stories possessed remarkable power, or they connected to something widely shared, memories preserved across cultures because they mattered universally. The transformation continued, but something at the center remained unchanged. That stability demands explanation. When the Jews were exiled to Babylon, they encountered stories that sounded familiar. Creation from chaos, a flood that destroyed the world, giants born from divine human unions. The Babylonians said these things happened. The Hebrew text said very similar things happened. Same events, different events, common sources, no one knows for certain. The Babylonian exile lasted from 586 to 538 BCE. Jerusalem's elite priests, scribes, nobility were deported to Babylon, forced to live in the heart of Mesopotamian civilization. For the first time, Hebrew religious authorities encountered the great libraries of Babylon directly. They saw creation myths carved in stone. They heard flood narratives recited in temples. They read texts that paralleled their own traditions but predated them by over 1,000 years. Imagine what that encounter must have meant. You're a Hebrew scribe, trained in your people's sacred texts, convinced of their unique divine origin. Then you arrive in Babylon and discover that the Babylonians have similar stories, written down centuries before your people even existed as a distinct nation. The cognitive dissonance would have been profound. The parallels are specific and striking. Genesis describes creation in 7 days, God separating waters above from waters below, bringing order from chaos. The Enuma Elish describes similar cosmic separation, similar progression from formless void to organized cosmos. Genesis describes a catastrophic flood, one righteous man warned by God, building a boat to exact specifications, preserving his family and animal pairs, landing on a mountain, sending out birds to test whether water had receded. The Epic of Gilgamesh and Atrahasis contain the same sequence of events, same procedural details, even similar measurements for the boat's dimensions. Genesis chapter 6 mentions the Nephilim, offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, described as mighty men of renown. Mesopotamian texts describe similar divine human offspring, heroes of extraordinary size and strength, the hybrid beings whose existence allegedly provoked the flood. Scholarly debate about these parallels has continued for over a century. Did Hebrew scribes directly borrow from Mesopotamian sources, adapting earlier texts to fit their own theological framework? Are the similarities evidence of independent development from a common Semitic cultural background, both traditions drawing on shared ancient memories? Or do they preserve actual historical memories of real events, interpreted through different cultural and religious lenses? What's clear is that if borrowing occurred, it wasn't simple copying. It was radical theological transformation. Mesopotamian narratives were polytheistic, featuring multiple gods with conflicting agendas, cosmic politics, divine councils making decisions through debate and vote. Hebrew scriptures transformed this into strict monotheism. Multiple gods became one God, though traces of divine plurality sometimes appear. Let us make man in our image. The divine council implicitly present even in monotheistic context. Mesopotamian gods needed humans, created them as workers to relieve divine labor. The Hebrew God creates from generosity or inscrutable purpose, needing nothing from his creation. Cosmic battles between deities become divine speech acts. Let there be light, replacing violent conflict as the mechanism of creation. The theological shifts are fundamental, transforming not just details but entire cosmological frameworks. This complicates everything. When Genesis describes the Nephilim or the flood, is it referring to the same events Mesopotamian texts describe? Is it acknowledging those sources while reinterpreting them theologically? Is it creating counter-narratives, deliberately modifying Mesopotamian claims? Ancient cultures weren't isolated. They interacted, borrowed, adapted, transformed each other's stories. Understanding biblical narratives requires understanding this cultural context. These earlier sources, the complex web of textual relationships spanning the ancient Near East. The questions multiply rather than resolve, but the connections are undeniable. The priests who copied these tablets across generations, did they believe the Anunnaki literally descended from heaven? Did they understand it as allegory? Did they know something we don't? We have their books, but we don't have their lessons. The explanations they gave students, the meanings they saw in the words they preserved so carefully. Mesopotamian temples functioned as households of gods. Priests were divine servants, performing elaborate rituals to maintain cosmic order and ensure divine favor. The gods resided in their temples, ate the meals offered to them, required daily care. At least, that was the public understanding. But evidence suggests different levels of religious knowledge existed within the priestly hierarchy. Exoteric teachings were accessible to everyone. Public festivals where communities gathered. Basic mythology explaining the gods and their relationships. Common prayers anyone could recite. This was the religion of the marketplace, the shared cultural framework binding society together. But there was also esoteric knowledge, reserved for initiated priests. Temple mysteries performed in sealed chambers. Hidden texts kept in restricted library sections. Rituals whose meanings weren't explained to outsiders. The inner circles of priesthoods guarded information they considered too sacred or too dangerous for common access. What did these priests believe about the texts they preserved? We find evidence of sophisticated theological thinking in Mesopotamian literature, philosophical commentaries on myths, texts offering naturalistic explanations for divine actions, astronomical observations so precise they demonstrate scientific knowledge existing alongside religious interpretation. These weren't primitive superstitions. They were complex intellectual frameworks developed over millennia. The concept of the Apkallu recurs throughout Mesopotamian tradition. These were the 7 sages who appeared before the flood to teach civilization to humanity. They instructed in agriculture, architecture, astronomy, mathematics, writing. According to the texts, they established the foundations of knowledge that later cultures built upon. Mesopotamian priests saw themselves as inheritors of that ancient wisdom, keepers of secrets passed down from the antediluvian world. Specific evidence supports the existence of genuine mysteries. Texts describing temple rituals that outsiders couldn't witness. References to secret knowledge of the Apkallu restricted to initiated priests. Astronomical observations maintained across centuries, requiring institutional commitment to long-term knowledge, preservation projects that transcended individual lifetimes. Someone coordinated this. Someone taught successors why it mattered. Someone maintained continuity of purpose across generations. What motivated such dedication? Perhaps genuine belief that the narratives were historically true, actual records of real events. Perhaps understanding of their cultural and political importance, recognition that these stories held society together, or perhaps knowledge, or at least suspicion, that the texts contained information worth protecting, even if its full significance wasn't understood by current keepers. We face a tragic gap. When the last cuneiform scribes died, when temples closed, when the tradition finally ended sometime in the 1st century CE, the interpretive frameworks died with them. We have the texts they preserved, thousands of tablets recovered from library ruins, but we've lost the oral teachings, the explanations given to students, the layers of meaning that would have accompanied the written words. We're reading their books without their teachers, trying to understand complex texts without the cultural context that made their full meaning accessible. The priests kept mysteries we can only partially reconstruct. The words survived, but did the wisdom? When they pulled those tablets from the sand and finally decoded them, they weren't just finding lost cities or ancient kings. They were finding us our stories, our questions, our attempts to understand where we came from. The Sumerians had been silent for 2,000 years. Suddenly, they could speak again. Picture the moment. Victorian scholars in London, bent over clay fragments shipped from Mesopotamia, slowly assembling words in a language no one had spoken for millennia. They're reading a flood narrative familiar enough. Then recognition hits. This isn't from the Bible. It predates the Bible by more than 1,000 years. The story they thought belonged exclusively to their scripture existed first in cuneiform, pressed into clay by Babylonian hands before Moses was even a name. The ground shifted beneath them. Not just academically, spiritually. Everything they assumed about their culture's uniqueness suddenly looked different. The Bible wasn't standing alone in history. It was connected to something older, part of a broader conversation happening across the ancient Near East. Civilization itself stretched back further than anyone had imagined, more complex, more sophisticated, more literate, and the flood narrative was just the beginning. Creation myths that made Genesis look recent, law codes that predated Moses by centuries, proving that justice and social order didn't originate with Hebrew scripture. Literature, actual literature, with poetry and character and narrative sophistication, rivaling Homer in age and surpassing him in antiquity. Astronomical records suggesting the Babylonians had been observing the sky systematically for longer than European civilization had existed. Each tablet expanded the map of human history. Sumerian civilization emerged as the oldest literate culture we could document. Akkadian and Babylonian empires took shape from fragments. Millennia of continuous cultural development became visible, layer by layer, as scholars learned to read the ancient languages and connect the pieces. What this recovery meant went beyond academics. It proved something profound. What seems eternally lost can be found again with patience. Human voices can speak across impossible gulfs of time. Cultural continuity exists beneath apparent rupture. The past isn't truly gone if someone preserved it, even accidentally, and the work continues. New tablets surface regularly in museum storage, private collections, archaeological sites. Satellite imagery reveals mounds that might contain libraries. Digital analysis decodes texts too damaged for human eyes. Teams of scholars spend entire careers reconstructing civilization from fragments, publishing translations, connecting narratives separated by centuries. There's something peculiar about reading these texts. You're holding thoughts preserved in clay, reading words someone wrote 5,000 years ago, their hand pressing the stylus, their mind constructing sentences. The distance between you collapses. You're connected through language, through curiosity, through the simple fact that they wrote, and you're reading. But what we've recovered is only a fraction. Vast numbers of tablets remain underground, unexcavated. Sites were destroyed before archaeologists arrived. We know certain texts existed, catalogues reference them, other works quote them, but we haven't found them, may never find them. The silence holds more than the speaking ever will. Still, what we have is enough to change everything. Enough to make the Sumerians contemporary again. Enough to hear their questions and recognize our own. The Sumerians asked, "Where did we come from?" We asked the same question. They answered, "Gods from the sky made us." We answer, "Evolution across millions of years." Different answers. Same question. Maybe the question matters more than the answer. Maybe asking is what makes us human. Strip away 5,000 years of technological progress, scientific method, accumulated knowledge. The fundamental questions remain identical. Why do we exist? Are we alone in the universe? What is our relationship to whatever might be greater than ourselves? How should we organize our societies? What happens when we die? The Anunnaki narratives addressed every single one, and they offered answers. Creation by higher intelligence gave existence, purpose, and meaning. Divine order reflected in social hierarchy, justified kingship, explained why some commanded and others served. Catastrophes became divine judgment, making sense of suffering and loss. The afterlife or its absence in some texts shaped ethical frameworks, influenced how people treated each other, determined what mattered. We approach the same questions differently now. Evolutionary biology explains origins without requiring divine intervention. Neuroscience and psychology explore consciousness and purpose through brain chemistry and cognitive patterns. Sociology examines power structures without appealing to heaven's mandate. Cosmology searches for meaning in a vast universe that might be utterly indifferent to our existence. But notice the tension. Ancient answers provided certainty. They offered meaning, comfort, clear moral frameworks. You knew why you existed, what was expected, where you fit in the cosmic order. Modern answers provide evidence and mechanism. They're more accurate, more testable, more reliable. They're also often less comforting, more uncertain. They carry more existential weight. Was the ancient approach really so different from ours? The Sumerians observed the world. They developed explanatory frameworks. They built on what previous generations discovered. They refined understanding over time. That's essentially the scientific method applied to questions science still can't fully answer. Because evolution explains how we developed, but not why consciousness emerged. Neuroscience maps brain activity, but struggles with the hard problem of subjective experience. Physics describes the universe's mechanics, but stays silent on purpose or meaning. We've traded mythological answers for scientific ones, but we haven't escaped the questions themselves. Some find modern alternatives to ancient religious frameworks. They accept evolutionary origins while seeking transcendent meaning through philosophy, art, connection. Others integrate both approaches, understanding psychological functions of myth while still finding truth in mythological frameworks, balancing scientific naturalism with openness to mystery. The methods changed. The technology advanced. We know vastly more about physical reality than the Sumerians ever could, but we're still asking their questions, still searching for answers, still wondering if we're alone, if we matter, if existence has purpose beyond biological imperatives. The tablets speak across millennia because they address what doesn't change. Human consciousness confronting itself, finite beings contemplating infinity, mortal creatures wondering about meaning. We've accumulated knowledge, but we haven't resolved the fundamental mysteries. Maybe we never will. Maybe that's what connects us to those ancient scribes, not shared answers, but shared questions that define what it means to be human. Maybe the Anunnaki weren't gods or aliens. Maybe they were us, our hopes, our fears, our understanding of power and knowledge and creation, projected onto the sky. When the Sumerians wrote about beings who made humans then grew distant, maybe they were writing about every child's experience of parents, every culture's experience of time. Look at what these narratives reveal about human psychology. The need to feel created for purpose, rather than existing by accident. The desire for contact with higher intelligence, something greater than ourselves. The fear of abandonment, of being separated from whatever divine source gave us meaning. The weight of mortality and the persistent dream of transcendence. The creation narrative itself embodies this tension perfectly. Humans are special, created by gods, bearing divine essence, capable of thought and language and civilization. But humans are also limited, made to serve, fundamentally mortal, forever separated from true divinity. That contradiction produces something profound, simultaneous dignity and humility. We matter, but we're not ultimate. We're significant, but not supreme. The flood narrative functions similarly. It embodies universal fears, catastrophic destruction beyond human control, divine judgment for human failings, the possibility that everything could be swept away without warning, but also hope, preservation, renewal, second chances. The world can end, but life continues. Everything can be lost, but not everything. Consider the Anunnaki themselves as psychological projections. They're idealized parents who create and teach, then withdraw, leaving children to manage independently. They're authorities who provide order and meaning, but demand obedience and service. They're beings more advanced than us who might return someday, might judge, might save, might condemn. That's every child's experience of powerful adults. Every citizen's experience of distant authorities. Every generation's experience of ancestors who built the world, then departed. These narratives helped ancient peoples process universal human experiences. Separation from parental care becomes gods withdrawing from direct involvement. Natural disasters become divine judgment and cosmic reset. Social inequality becomes divinely ordained hierarchy that provides meaning rather than mere injustice. Even mortality finds meaning. Even mighty Gilgamesh, part divine, must die. No one escapes the fundamental human condition. Understanding myths psychologically, rather than historically, transforms them. They become tools for self-understanding. Maps of human consciousness, expressions of what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious patterns of human experience that transcend particular cultures and manifest across time and space. the human psyche expressing itself through stories of gods, heroes, floods, and creation. Jung saw in these narratives archetypes that appear everywhere humans tell stories. The divine creator, the great flood, the hero seeking immortality, the wise teacher, the distant parent. These aren't Sumerian inventions, they're human inventions that the Sumerians happened to write down early. They appear in every culture because they reflect universal structures of human consciousness and experience. Does this psychological approach diminish the narratives? Does understanding them as projections make them less meaningful? Or does it reveal deeper truth that these stories matter precisely because they're about us, about human nature, about the internal landscapes we all navigate? When we read about the Anunnaki creating humans to bear their burden, maybe we're reading about consciousness becoming aware of itself as separate from nature, bearing the burden of self-awareness and mortality. When we read about gods withdrawing, maybe we're reading about the universal human experience of time, the past receding, ancestors becoming memory, each generation inheriting a world they didn't make and must somehow manage. The myths are mirrors. Look closely. You'll see yourself reflected in 5,000-year-old clay. Maybe we'll never know for certain what the tablets really mean. Whether the Anunnaki were gods, aliens, humans, or metaphors. Whether the flood happened or was imagined. Whether any of it was real. But maybe not knowing is okay. Maybe the mystery is the point. Maybe asking is more important than answering. Modern culture trains us differently. We're taught to seek single correct answers, to resolve ambiguity, to choose sides. Ancient texts become battlegrounds where interpretations clash. Either the narratives are historical records, or they're pure mythology. Either the Anunnaki were literal beings, or symbolic constructs. Pick one, defend it, dismiss alternatives. But something gets lost in that certainty. The ability to appreciate these texts on multiple levels simultaneously disappears. Pre-modern peoples engaged with mystery comfortably, holding sacred stories as simultaneously true in different ways, historically, spiritually, symbolically, psychologically. They didn't require choosing. The modern insistence on singular interpretation closes doors that used to remain open. What does it mean to hold the mystery? To examine the Anunnaki narratives as mythology while remaining open to possible historical kernels. To appreciate their psychological truth while acknowledging we can't definitively disprove their literal claims. To engage seriously with alternative interpretations without requiring commitment to any single framework. It means sitting with uncertainty rather than rushing to resolution. Why does this matter? Because rigid certainty in either direction closes off possibilities. Declaring these definitely myths prevents recognizing potential historical memory. Insisting they're definitely historical prevents understanding their cultural and psychological functions. Both positions stop inquiry, both create conflict where curiosity would serve better. Questions without answers possess their own value. They keep us engaged, thinking, wondering, seeking. Settled answers let us stop looking. Mysteries keep us awake. The Anunnaki narratives have generated questions for 5 millennia, precisely because they resist simple resolution. That persistence suggests something important about their nature, their purpose, maybe even their origin. What would the Sumerians think of our debates? Would they find our arguments amusing? Scholars centuries from now, still arguing about what they meant, what they knew, what they believed. Would they be frustrated that we've missed something obvious? Or would they be quietly pleased that their words still matter, still provoke thought, still connect humans across impossible distances of time? Perhaps the text's meaning isn't fixed. Each generation brings new questions, tools, perspectives to the ancient words. Victorian scholars saw challenges to biblical authority. Early 20th century readers saw mythology and folklore. Mid-century audiences considered ancient astronauts. Contemporary minds explore psychological archetypes, cultural memory, historical possibilities previously unconsidered. The tablets haven't changed. We have. And will continue changing, finding new significance in the same cuneiform marks. Maybe the Anunnaki narrative's greatest gift isn't answers but the questions they keep alive. Questions about origins that science addresses mechanically but not meaningfully. Questions about purpose that philosophy explores but never resolves. Questions about our place in the cosmos. About whether consciousness or intelligence exists beyond our own. About mysteries that persist despite millennia of inquiry. The tablets remain silent on ultimate questions, but they've given us something precious. Witnessing how other humans, in another time, grappled with the same mysteries we still face. They asked where they came from. We ask the same. They wondered if they were alone. We wonder too. Across 5,000 years the questions echo. And perhaps that's enough.